A 9-year-old girl walks into a biker garage during the worst storm Ash Creek, Kentucky has seen in 40 years, carrying a dead man's watch and a secret that will crack this town wide open. The man inside that garage hasn't spoken to his own daughter in 6 years. He's covered in engine grease, scar tissue, and silence. And tonight, a child he's never met is about to force him to choose between the man he's been hiding behind and the man his dead father begged him to become. This is a story about broken people, dangerous roads, and the terrifying moment when doing the right thing might cost you everything you have left. Stay with me until the very end. I promise you, this one's gonna hit different. If you're watching right now, drop a like, leave a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from, and let's ride. The rain came sideways, not the soft kind that farmers talk about over morning coffee, not the kind that makes children press their faces to windows and watch the world blur. This was Kentucky violence, horizontal sheets of cold water slamming against every surface like the sky had finally lost its patience with the town below. Thunder cracked so hard it rattled the bay doors of Harlan Motor Works and sent a half-empty coffee mug sliding across the workbench until it hit a socket wrench and stopped. The fluorescent lights above the garage flickered once, twice, then held steady with that low electrical hum that sounds like a dying man trying to breathe. Caleb Rook. Harlan didn't look up. He was underneath a 2004 Softail with rust creeping along the exhaust headers, his scarred knuckles wrapped around a box wrench, his gray beard flecked with grease and sweat. 61 years old, 217 pounds of leather, bad decisions, and silence. The garage smelled the way it always smelled. Motor oil, stale coffee, cigarette smoke baked into concrete walls that hadn't been painted since his father was alive. A Pall Mall burned in an ashtray on the floor beside his left boot, the smoke curling upward into the fluorescent light like a question nobody wanted to answer. Outside, the neon sign that read Harlan Motor Works, Estant 1979, buzzed and bled red light into the rain. Puddles on the cracked asphalt parking lot caught the glow and turned it into trembling rivers of color, red and gold mixing with the black water running toward the storm drains. 3 Harleys sat under the overhang near the side entrance, their chrome catching lightning flashes. They belonged to men who were somewhere else tonight, men with patch-covered vests and long memories and the kind of loyalty that doesn't show up on paper. Caleb tightened the wrench. The bolt fought him. Everything fought him lately. 3 days ago, he'd lost the only thing worth a damn in this whole building. Not the tools, not the lifts, not the sign with his family name on it. A pocket watch. Silver. Military issue. Belonged to his father, Staff Sergeant Davis Harlan, who carried it through 2 combat deployments and brought it home inside a boot because his pockets had been shredded by shrapnel. Engraved on the back in letters so small you had to hold it under light to read, "Do right when no one is watching." Caleb had carried that watch every day for 23 years, kept it in the left pocket of whatever vest he wore, felt its weight against his ribs like a second heartbeat. And then, 3 days ago, it was gone. Dropped somewhere between the garage and the gas station on Route 12, or maybe stolen off the bench while he stepped out back to argue with a parts supplier on the phone. He didn't know. He just reached for it and found nothing. And something about that emptiness, that small, specific absence, had opened a door inside him that he'd spent years nailing shut. The rain intensified. Caleb slid out from under the Softail and sat on the creeper, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black. The garage was empty except for him. 4 lifts, 2 project bikes, a wall of pegboard tools organized the way his father taught him. Wrenches ascending left to right, screwdrivers grouped by head, everything in its place. A framed photograph near the register showed a younger Caleb standing next to a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, both of them squinting into summer sunlight beside a freshly painted Sportster. The girl was Caroline, his daughter. She was 23 now, living somewhere in Virginia, and she hadn't returned his calls in 6 years. He didn't blame her. The phone on the wall was old rotary, kept more out of stubbornness than function. His cell sat on the workbench, screen cracked, battery at 11%. No missed calls, no messages. The only sounds were rain, thunder, the fluorescent hum, and the slow drip of water leaking through a crack in the roof near Bay 3 that he kept meaning to fix and never did. Caleb lit another cigarette and stared at the concrete floor between his boots. The floor had oil stains shaped like countries on a map nobody would ever want to visit. He was thinking about the watch again when the side door opened. The wind hit first, cold, wet, angry, shoving rain across the threshold in a spray that darkened the concrete. Then a shape appeared in the doorway. Small. Thin. Shivering so hard it looked like the bones were trying to escape the skin. A girl. 9 years old. Maybe 10. Soaked through to the marrow. Brown hair plastered flat against her skull, dripping onto a hoodie 2 sizes too big that hung past her wrists like she'd stolen it from someone's clothesline. Sneakers so wet they squeaked against the floor with every step. She stood just inside the doorway with her arms wrapped around something pressed to her chest. A cardboard box, the cheap kind you get at dollar stores for jewelry or small gifts. The box was wet too, softening at the corners, but she held it like it contained the last warm thing left on Earth. Caleb stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them moved for 3 full seconds. Thunder rolled overhead like a freight train dragging chains. "Garage is closed," Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Gravel and smoke and years of talking to machines instead of people. The girl didn't leave. She blinked rainwater from her eyelashes and said, "I know." Caleb exhaled smoke through his nose. "Then why are you standing in my shop at 9:30 on a Tuesday night in the middle of a goddamn monsoon?" She looked down at the box in her hands, then back up at him. Her eyes were brown and enormous and filled with something that wasn't fear, exactly. It was closer to determination, the kind of expression you see on soldiers right before they do something stupid and brave. "I found something that belongs to you," she said. Caleb didn't move. The cigarette burned between his fingers. Rain hammered the roof above them like fists on a table. "I don't know you," he said. "I know," she said again. Then she walked forward, dripping, shaking, sneakers squeaking, and held out the cardboard box with both hands, arms extended, the way a child presents something fragile to an adult they're not sure they can trust. Caleb took the box. It weighed almost nothing. He opened the lid with oil-stained fingers, and for a moment the world went perfectly still. No rain, no thunder, no hum, no drip, no breath. His father's watch sat on a folded piece of paper towel inside the box. Silver, scratched. The chain was broken near the clasp, but the case was intact, and when he turned it over, the engraving caught the fluorescent light and threw it back at him like an accusation. Do right when no one is watching. The second hand was still moving. Tick, tick, tick. Steady as a pulse. Caleb's jaw tightened. Something behind his sternum shifted. A pressure that wasn't pain but was close enough to be its neighbor. He looked up at the girl. She hadn't moved. She stood there dripping, arms now at her sides, watching him with those enormous brown eyes. "Where did you find this?" he asked. His voice was quieter now. "Parking lot at the Crossroads fuel stop on Route 12. It was in the gravel near the air pump. The chain was already broken." 3 days ago?" She nodded. "And you kept it?" She hesitated, the first crack in her armor. She looked at the floor. "I almost didn't bring it back." The silence between them lasted long enough for the leak in Bay 3 to drip 4 times. Caleb waited. He'd learned a long time ago that silence pulls truth out of people faster than questions. "My mom owes rent," the girl said, still looking at the floor. 2 months. There's a man at the pawn shop on Cedar Street who said he'd give me $40 for it. Said the silver alone was worth that. Dwayne Mercer. She looked up. "You know him?" "I know him." Caleb's voice had gone flat. Cold. The way a man's voice gets when he's naming someone he doesn't respect. "You went to Mercer's shop with my father's watch." "I went. I stood outside for a long time. Then I went in. He looked at the watch. He said $40. He opened the register. And? And I read the back." Caleb didn't say anything. "Do right when no one is watching," the girl recited, her voice small but steady. "I didn't know what it meant at first, but then I thought about it while I walked home, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I thought, if this was my dad's watch and someone found it, I'd want them to bring it back." "Do you have a dad?" "No." The word landed on the concrete floor like a dropped wrench. No explanation, no softening, just the fact, hard and clean. Caleb closed the lid of the box and set it on the workbench beside his cracked phone. He looked at the girl for a long moment, at the oversized hoodie, the ruined sneakers, the way she was still shivering but standing straight, like pride was the only thing keeping her vertical. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maddie. Maddie Whitaker." "How'd you know this was my shop, Maddie?" The watch had initials on the inside of the case. DH. I asked around. Somebody at the fuel stop said Davis Harlan used to own the motorcycle garage on Pershing Street. I looked it up. Caleb nodded slowly. 9 years old, found a watch, tracked the owner through initials and local knowledge, walked through a storm at night to return it, turned down $40 her family needed to survive. He tried to remember the last time an adult in this town had done something that decent, and he couldn't. "You walked here?" he asked. "Yes." "From where?" "Ridgeline Apartments, on Sycamore." Caleb knew the Ridgeline. Everybody in Ash Creek knew the Ridgeline. It was a 3-story block of crumbling concrete and stained siding on the east side of town where the landlords charged too much and fixed nothing, and the hallways smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. It was the kind of place where people lived when they had nowhere left to fall. It was a 40-minute walk from here in good weather. "That's 3 miles, he said. "I know. In this storm." I couldn't wait. The box was getting wet. Something cracked behind Caleb's ribs. Not the watch. Not the walk. The box. She was worried about the box. About the packaging. About making sure a stranger's dead father's watch arrived dry and safe inside a dollar store jewelry box that she'd probably found in a drawer at home or bought with change from a jar. He stood up. The creeper rolled backward and hit the wall. He crossed to the small office at the back of the garage, a cluttered room with a desk, a filing cabinet, a space heater that rattled when it ran, and a coffee pot with yesterday's brew still sitting in it, black and bitter and lukewarm. He poured a cup and brought it back. Then he stopped, looked at the girl, and poured the coffee out into a shop sink. "You drink coffee?" he asked. "No." "Good. That stuff would kill you." He opened a small refrigerator under the parts counter and pulled out a can of ginger ale. He popped the tab and handed it to her. She took it. Her fingers were white with cold. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward a metal stool near the workbench. "I'm calling your mother." Maddie's expression changed. For the first time, something close to worry moved across her face. "She doesn't know I'm here." "I figured." "She's going to be mad." "She should be. It's almost 10 at night and you walked 3 miles through a thunderstorm to give a stranger his watch back. That's either the bravest thing or the dumbest thing I've heard this year, and I'm not sure which." Maddie sat on the stool and wrapped both hands around the ginger ale. "Can you not tell her about the pawn shop part?" Caleb paused. He looked at her. She looked at the floor. And in that moment, a door opened inside him that he hadn't touched in years. Not the door the watch had cracked open, but the one behind it. The one labeled Father. The one he'd boarded shut with road miles and engine noise and silence because every time he looked through it, all he saw was the face of a girl he'd failed. "I won't tell her about the pawn shop," he said. "But you should." "Why?" "Because your mother is raising you right, and she deserves to know it worked." Maddie looked up at him. Something softened in her expression. Not trust yet, but the possibility of it. The first tentative step onto a bridge that might or might not hold weight. Caleb pulled out his cell phone and said, "What's the number?" She gave it to him. He dialed. It rang 4 times and then a woman's voice answered. Sharp, breathless, already scared. The voice of a mother who's noticed an empty bed. "Miss Whitaker? My name is Caleb Harlan. I own Harlan Motor Works on Pershing Street. Your daughter is here. She's safe. She's dry. Well, getting there. She came to return something that belongs to me." He paused, listened. The voice on the other end went from scared to confused to something that sounded dangerously close to tears. "No, ma'am. She's fine. I'll keep her warm until you get here. Take your time on the roads. They're bad tonight." He hung up and set the phone on the workbench. "She's coming," he said. She sounded mad. She sounded scared. There's a difference. When you're older, you'll know which one is worse. Maddie sipped the ginger ale and looked around the garage, at the bikes on the lifts, the tools on the pegboard, the oil stains on the floor, the photograph near the register. Her eyes stopped on the picture. "Is that your daughter?" she asked. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He lit a cigarette, took one long drag, and exhaled smoke toward the leaking ceiling. "Yeah. Where is she?" "Virginia. Maybe." "You don't know?" "We don't talk much." "How come?" "Because I spent too many years being the kind of man who thinks silence is the same thing as strength. And by the time I figured out it wasn't, she'd already stopped waiting." Maddie stared at him. "That's sad." "Yeah." "Do you miss her?" The cigarette trembled between his fingers. He steadied it. "Every day since the day I stopped deserving to." The rain kept coming. The fluorescent lights kept humming. The watch kept ticking on the workbench inside its soggy cardboard box, and somewhere between the storm and the silence, two strangers sat in a cold garage and didn't talk for a while, and it was enough. 20 minutes later, a battered Chevy Malibu pulled into the parking lot. The headlights swept across the bay doors and caught the chrome on the Harleys outside. The engine coughed twice before dying. A woman got out, mid-30s, thin, wearing a server's uniform from the Bluegrass Diner on Main Street with a name tag that said Rachel. She'd thrown a denim jacket over the uniform but hadn't zipped it, and the rain hit her like it had been waiting for her all night. She came through the side door fast, eyes scanning, and found Maddie on the stool. She crossed the garage in 4 steps and grabbed the girl by both shoulders. "Matilda Ann Whitaker." "Mom, do you have any idea?" Rachel's voice cracked. She pulled the girl into her chest and held her so tight the ginger ale crumpled between them. "Do you have any idea what I thought when I came home and you were gone? I called Mrs. Patterson. I called the school. I was about to call the police." "I'm sorry, Mom." "You walked. In this. At night. Alone." Each phrase was a sentence. Each sentence was an indictment. Rachel held her daughter at arm's length and looked at her with eyes that were furious and terrified and grateful all at the same time. Caleb stayed back. He leaned against the workbench and smoked and watched the way Rachel's hands trembled on her daughter's shoulders, and he recognized that tremble. It was the shaking of a woman who has been holding everything together with nothing for so long that even a small scare feels like the whole structure might collapse. "Miss Whitaker," he said quietly. "She brought me something." Rachel looked at him for the first time. Really looked. She saw the beard, the grease, the leather vest with faded patches, the scarred hands, the hard eyes. He saw her calculating. Biker, garage, alone with her daughter. Every alarm in her body was firing. "It's all right," he said. "She came to return a watch, my father's watch. She found it 3 days ago." "A watch?" "Silver, military, means everything to me. She walked through that storm to bring it back." Rachel looked at Maddie. "You told me you lost your good hoodie at school." Maddie looked at the floor. "I wore it to keep the box dry." Rachel closed her eyes. Something moved across her face. Not anger anymore, something deeper. Something like awe at the child she'd somehow managed to raise alone in a falling-apart apartment with overdue rent and double shifts and no safety net. She opened her eyes, and they were wet. "Thank you for keeping her safe," Rachel said to Caleb. Her voice had shifted. The protective edge was still there, but underneath it was exhaustion. The kind that goes bone deep, the kind that never fully goes away because there's always another shift, another bill, another night where the margin between making it and not making it is thinner than a coat of paint. "She kept herself safe," Caleb said. "I just gave her a ginger ale." Rachel managed something that was almost a smile. Almost. Caleb reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and took out $300, most of what he had in cash. He held it out toward Rachel. "No," she said. The word came out fast, hard, like a door slamming. "Your daughter returned something priceless to me. I want to—" "No." Rachel's chin lifted, her jaw set. She had the same look Maddie had when she walked through that door. The look of someone who would rather drown than take a hand that might pull them under. "We don't take money for doing the right thing. That's what I teach her. If I take your money now, Everything I've told her about honesty becomes a transaction. Caleb held the bills for another moment, then put them back in his wallet. He understood. He hated that he understood, because understanding meant respecting a woman's pride while watching her daughter shiver in a ruined hoodie, and there was nothing clean about that equation. Can I at least give you something for the road? Coffee? It's terrible, but it's hot. Rachel shook her head. We need to get home. Maddie has school tomorrow. In this storm? We've driven in worse. Caleb nodded. He walked to the office and came back with a clean shop towel, the thick kind, not the paper ones, and handed it to Maddie. For the ride. Maddie took it. She dried her face. Then she looked up at him and said, I'm glad I brought it back. Me too, kid. The watch is really old. Older than me. Was your dad nice? Caleb's throat tightened. He was better than nice. He was honest. My mom says honest is more important than nice. Your mom is right. Rachel put her hand on Maddie's back and guided her toward the door. At the threshold, she turned and looked at Caleb one more time. The fluorescent light caught the exhaustion in her face. The dark circles, the chapped lips, the way her server's apron was still tied under the denim jacket because she'd come straight from the diner without even changing. Mr. Harlan, she said, thank you for not calling the police. Wasn't any reason to. Some people would have, found a kid wandering alone at night. They'd assume the worst. About me. About her. I don't assume the worst about people who do the right thing. She held his gaze for one more second, then walked into the rain with her daughter. The Malibu's engine coughed back to life. The headlight swept the lot again, caught the neon sign, and disappeared down Pershing Street. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched them go. Rain hit his face and ran into his beard. He didn't move. The cold felt necessary, like penance for something he couldn't name. He went back inside and picked up the watch from the workbench, held it in his palm. The second hand ticked against his skin. Steady, patient, relentless. He turned it over and read the engraving again. Do right when no one is watching. His father had lived by those words. Caleb had carried the watch but ignored the message for decades, letting it become nothing more than weight in his pocket while he rode away from every person who needed him to stay. He set the watch on the desk in the back office and sat in the creaking chair. The space heater rattled. The coffee was cold. A stack of invoices sat under a Snap-on Tools catalog, and beneath that, half hidden like evidence of a crime, was a letter he'd started writing to Caroline 7 months ago and never finished. Dear Caroline, I know you don't want to hear from me. That's where it stopped. 5 drafts. 5 versions of the same opening line. 5 attempts to build a bridge out of words when he'd spent years burning the road behind him. The framed photograph by the register caught his eye again. Caroline at 7, gap-toothed, squinting, standing beside a bike she'd helped him wash, soap still on her little hands. He remembered that day. June, hot, the hose running cold, her laughing when the water hit his boots. He remembered thinking, I will never let this kid down. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain. The next morning came gray and cold, the kind of Kentucky November day where the sky sits about 8 feet off the ground and the whole world smells like wet pavement and dead leaves. Caleb opened the garage at 7, same as always. Coffee on by 7:05. First cigarette by 7:08. The parking lot was still puddled from last night's storm, and the neon sign buzzed in the daylight with that pathetic insistence of something that doesn't know when to quit. By 8, 2 regulars showed up. Wade Jessup, ex-Army, prosthetic left leg below the knee, rebuilt carburetors the way some men write poetry, pulled his Road King into Bay 2 and started working without being asked. Tommy Cahill followed 15 minutes later in his truck, bringing donuts from the gas station and a thermos of something he called coffee, but that tasted like it had been filtered through a boot. They were part of the informal crew that orbited Harland Motor Works. Not a club exactly, not anymore, but men who'd ridden together, bled together, and now spent their middle age keeping machines alive because it was easier than keeping themselves alive. Wade noticed it first. You look like hell, he said, not looking up from the carburetor. I always look like hell. Worse than usual. You sleep? Some. Tommy glanced over from the donut box. Something happen? Caleb poured coffee into the same mug that had slid across the workbench during last night's storm. The stain on the side looked like a map of a place he'd never been. Kid showed up last night, 9 years old, found the watch. Wade stopped working. Tommy put down the donut. Your old man's watch? Wade asked. Walked 3 miles through that storm to bring it back. 3 miles? In that? From the ridgeline. Wade and Tommy exchanged a look. Everyone knew the ridgeline. The look said everything. Surprise, concern, and the particular gravity that comes when men who've seen the worst of the world encounter something unexpectedly decent. She could have sold it, Tommy said. Almost did. Took it to Mercer's place first. The name landed in the garage like a piece of shrapnel nobody wanted to touch. Dwayne Mercer, Cedar Street Pawn and Loan. The kind of man who smiled when he underpaid you and called it fair market value. The kind of man who bought wedding rings from divorced women and hunting rifles from widows and never once lost sleep over the margin. Half the town had been inside his shop at one point or another, standing on the wrong side of that glass counter, selling something they loved because the math didn't work anymore. Mercer offered her $40, Caleb said. For a military-issue silver watch? That's theft. That's Mercer. Wade set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. So the kid turned down the money and brought it back to you. Yeah. And you're sitting here looking like somebody died because a 9-year-old showed more backbone than most men you know. Caleb didn't answer. He drank his coffee and stared through the open bay door at the wet parking lot, the gray sky, the bare trees lining Pershing Street like skeletons waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to stop standing. Her mother refused the cash, he said after a while. I offered $300. She wouldn't take it. Pride, Tommy said. No, principle. There's a difference. She said taking money for doing the right thing turns it into a transaction. Said it would undo everything she's teaching the kid. Wade leaned back and crossed his arms over his chest. The prosthetic leg clicked against the concrete floor. That woman sounds like she's fighting a war nobody can see. She's a server at the Bluegrass Diner, works doubles, came to pick up her kids still wearing the apron. Husband? No husband. Maddie said no father, just the two of them. The garage went quiet except for the drip in Bay 3 and the low rumble of traffic on Pershing. 3 men sat with their coffee and their scars and their private calculations, measuring the distance between what they'd been given in life and what Rachel Whitaker was trying to hold together with nothing. You gonna do something? Wade asked. About what? About any of it. The kid. The mother. Mercer sitting in his shop right now probably already forgot about a 9-year-old who walked away from $40 because her mother taught her that honesty matters more than eating. Caleb finished his coffee and set the mug down. His jaw worked beneath the beard. His eyes had gone to that place Wade recognized, the place where the old road dog makes a decision before his mouth catches up. I'm going to go talk to Mercer, Caleb said. That's a bad idea. Probably. He's connected, drinks with the county assessor, plays poker with 2 of the town council members. You walk into his shop looking for trouble, he'll make trouble back. I'm not looking for trouble. I'm looking for something else. What? Caleb picked up the watch from the workbench. The second hand ticked. The engraving caught the gray morning light through the bay doors and held it. I don't know yet, he said, but I'll know when I find it. He pulled on his leather jacket, cracked, faded, smelling of highway miles and cold nights, and walked to his bike. A 2001 Road King. Black, loud. The kind of machine that announces itself 2 blocks before it arrives. He threw a leg over, hit the starter, and the engine turned over with a sound that shook rainwater off the chrome pipes. Wade watched him from the bay. Tommy watched from the donut box. Neither of them said, "Be careful." They knew better. Caleb pulled out of the lot, turned east on Pershing, and rode toward Cedar Street with the cold November air cutting through his beard and the weight of a dead man's watch in his vest pocket, ticking against his ribs like a second heart that refused to stop beating. Cedar Street Pawn and Loan sat between a laundromat and a tax preparation office that was only open 4 months a year. The storefront window was filled with the usual inventory of other people's misfortunes: guitars, power tools, jewelry under glass, a saxophone with a dented bell, and a row of watches that ranged from $20 Timexes to a counterfeit Rolex that Mercer probably told people was real. A small bell above the door rang when Caleb walked in. Dwayne Mercer stood behind the counter, mid-50s, soft hands, a polo shirt tucked into khakis with a belt that cost more than some of the items in his display cases. He had the face of a man who'd figured out early that sympathy is a commodity and sincerity is a tax, and he'd spent his adult life avoiding both. He looked up when Caleb entered, and his expression did something complicated. Part recognition, part wariness, part professional smile. "Caleb Harlan. Been a while. You looking to sell or buy?" "Neither." Mercer's smile thinned. "Then you're in the wrong store." Caleb walked to the counter. He didn't hurry. He let his boots hit the floor with every step. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of walk that fills a room with its own weather. He stopped on the other side of the glass case and looked at Mercer the way a man looks at a lock he's about to pick. "A kid came in here 3 days ago," Caleb said. 9 years old. Had a silver pocket watch. Military. You offered her $40. I get a lot of walk-ins. You remember her?" Mercer shrugged. One of those shrugs that's supposed to look casual but is actually a wall. "Little girl, brown hair, sure. I made her a fair offer. She didn't take it. $40 for a sterling silver military watch with hand-engraved casing. That's your idea of fair." "That's market value, Caleb. I'm not a charity." "No, you're not." Caleb leaned forward. Not threatening. Not yet. But close enough that Mercer could smell the leather and the engine grease and the years of hard road that separated them. "She's 9. Her mother can't make rent. She walked into your shop with something she found, and you looked at that child and saw an opportunity to steal." "I saw a transaction. That's what I do. People bring things in, I offer a price, they accept or they don't. She didn't. End of story." "No, it's not the end of the story. Because that little girl walked away from your $40, walked 3 miles through the worst storm this town's seen in a year, and gave me back my father's watch. She did that because her mother taught her something you never learned." Mercer's jaw tightened. The professional smile was gone. What replaced it was something meaner, the expression of a man who doesn't like being told what he is by someone he considers beneath him. "You come in here to lecture me, Caleb? Because I've got inventory to process." "I came to look you in the eye." "Well, you've looked. Anything else?" Caleb held the stare for 5 more seconds. Then he straightened up, turned, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. "The kid did the right thing when no one was watching, Mercer. And you did exactly what you always do. The difference is, she's 9 years old and she already knows something you never will." He walked out. The bell rang behind him. The cold hit his face like a slap. He sat on his bike in the parking lot and stared at the pawn shop window. His hands were shaking, not with fear, with something older and heavier. The realization that rage without direction is just noise, and he'd been making noise for 30 years while the world kept grinding down people like Rachel and Maddie. He pulled out his phone. Battery at 23%. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in 2 years. Boyd Iron Hand Maddox. Former sergeant-at-arms. The kind of man who could organize a supply convoy in a war zone and have it running smooth before the dust settled. Last Caleb heard, Boyd was running a small engine repair shop outside Lexington and going to physical therapy for a shoulder that had been rebuilt twice. He pressed call. It rang 6 times. Then a voice like broken rock picked up. "Harlan, you dead?" "Not yet." "Then why are you calling me?" Caleb looked at the gray sky, the wet street, the pawn shop window full of other people's losses. He felt the watch ticking against his chest. Steady, patient, waiting. "Because I need help building something," he said, "and I can't do it alone." The line was silent for a long time. Then Boyd said, "Building what?" And Caleb Harlan, 61 years old, scarred knuckles, haunted eyes, a man who hadn't asked anyone for anything in over a decade, said the truest sentence he'd spoken in years. "Something I should have started a long time ago." He hung up before Boyd could ask another question. Started the engine. The Harley shook beneath him like a living thing. He pulled out of the lot and turned west, back toward the garage, back toward the watch, back toward the photograph of a 7-year-old girl he'd failed. and toward the terrifying possibility that a 9-year-old stranger had just shown him the road back. But he didn't see the black sedan parked across the street from the pawn shop. Didn't see Mercer step to the window and write down his plate number. Didn't hear the phone call Mercer made 2 minutes later to someone at the county assessor's office. A call that started with, "We might have a problem," and ended with a name. Rachel Whitaker's name. Boyd Maddox arrived at Harlan Motor Works 2 days later in a rust-colored Ford F-250 with a cracked windshield and a toolbox bolted to the bed that weighed more than most men's ambitions. He parked next to the Harleys, killed the engine, and sat there for 45 seconds, long enough to finish a cigarette, scan the parking lot, count the exits, and decide whether he was making a mistake. Old habits. The kind that get drilled into your nervous system during 3 deployments and never fully leave, even when you're 57 years old and your right shoulder clicks every time you reach above your head. He stepped out. 6'2", broad through the chest and narrow through the eyes. A gray flat-top buzz cut that hadn't changed since 1991. Hands like catcher's mitts, scarred across the knuckles the same way Caleb's were. Not from fights, but from decades of metal, engines, and the particular violence that machines inflict on the men who love them. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, work boots that had been resoled twice, and no patches. Not anymore. But the way he walked, deliberate, unhurried, aware of every angle, told you everything the patches used to. Caleb met him at Bay 1. They looked at each other. Neither smiled. Men like them didn't smile at reunions. They measured. They assessed. They checked whether the other man still had the same weight behind his eyes, and if that weight had gotten heavier or lighter since the last time they stood in the same room. "You look old," Boyd said. "I am old." "You look older than old. You look like something ate you from the inside and spit out the bones." "That's about right." Boyd glanced around the garage, took in the lifts, the pegboard tools, the leaking ceiling, the photograph by the register, the coffee pot, the ashtray. His eyes stopped on Wade Jessup, who was sitting on an overturned milk crate near Bay 3, prosthetic legs stretched out, cleaning a set of spark plugs with a wire brush. Wade nodded. Boyd nodded back. 2 veterans recognizing each other across a room the way dogs recognize their own breed. "That's Wade," Caleb said. "Army. Lost the leg in Fallujah." "I know who he is. We met in 2009 at the Bluegrass Veterans Run." Boyd turned back to Caleb. "You said you wanted to build something. I drove 3 hours, so talk." Caleb poured 2 mugs of the terrible coffee and handed one to Boyd. They stood at the workbench. Caleb told him everything, the watch, the girl, the storm, Rachel's refusal, the pawn shop, Mercer's eyes when he realized he'd been seen for exactly what he was. He told it flat, without decoration, the way you tell a story, when the facts are enough and anything extra would be a lie. Boyd listened. He didn't interrupt. He drank the coffee without complaining about the taste, which told Caleb he'd had worse. When Caleb finished, Boyd set the mug down and stared at the watch sitting on the workbench in its cardboard box. "So a kid did what grown men in this town won't do," Boyd said. "That's the short version. And you want to, what? Start a fund? A charity?" "Not a charity. Something quieter. Something that doesn't make people feel small for needing help. I'm thinking families like Rachel's, people who are hanging on by their fingernails and too proud to ask. We find them before they fall. We help without asking them to beg for it." Boyd crossed his arms. The shoulder clicked. "And you want me involved because?" "Because you're the only man I know who can organize something like this and keep it clean. No politics, no egos, no speeches. Just work. You know what happened last time I organized something with bikers and money?" The sentence landed in the garage like a stone thrown into still water. Caleb's jaw tightened. Wade looked up from his spark plugs. Tommy Cahill, who'd been pretending to read a motorcycle parts catalog near the office door, stopped turning pages. "That was different," Caleb said. "Was it?" "That was Reno. That was a different situation. That was me trusting the wrong people with the wrong amount of money, and 3 men I considered brothers walking away with cash that was supposed to go to veterans' families. One of those men is dead now. One is in prison, and one, last I heard, is running a bar in Tucson and telling everybody he was never involved." Boyd's voice hadn't risen. It was flat and heavy, like concrete drying. So forgive me if I'm not jumping at the chance to handle money and trust again. This isn't Reno. It's always Reno, Caleb. You put money on the table and you ask broken men to guard it, eventually somebody's hand slips. That's not cynicism. That's experience. Caleb set his mug down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the workbench. Then why'd you drive 3 hours? Boyd didn't answer immediately. He picked up the watch from the box, held it in his palm the way Caleb had, carefully, like it might detonate. He turned it over and read the engraving. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he set it back down and looked at Caleb with something that wasn't agreement but wasn't refusal either. It was the look of a man standing at a door he'd sworn he'd never open again, testing the handle. Because you said you couldn't do it alone, Boyd said. And in 30 years, I've never heard you say that. The garage was quiet for a long time after that. Wade went back to his spark plugs. Tommy went back to pretending to read. The drip in Bay 3 kept its rhythm. And somewhere between the silence and the coffee and the ticking of a dead man's watch, 2 old soldiers started drawing up a plan on the back of an invoice envelope that smelled like motor oil. 3 days later, the first real problem arrived, wearing a county badge and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His name was Dale Overton. Deputy County Assessor, mid-40s, clean fingernails, pressed shirt, the kind of shoes that have never touched a puddle they didn't want to touch. He drove a county-issued sedan and parked it in the spot closest to the bay doors, which in Caleb's experience was either laziness or a power move. And with men like Overton, it was usually both. Caleb was underneath the softail again when the shadow fell across the concrete. He slid out and looked up at Overton standing over him with a clipboard and that smile. Mr. Harlan? You know who I am, Dale. Just being official, I'm here on a routine assessment. We've received a report that this property may not be in compliance with current commercial zoning regulations. It's been a garage since 1979. Things change, regulations update. I need to do a walkthrough, check for any structural modifications, unpermitted additions, that kind of thing. Overton clicked his pen. The sound was small and precise and irritating in the way that bureaucratic sounds always are. The sound of a system that doesn't care about you reminding you that it exists. Caleb stood up. He wiped his hands on the rag. He was taller than Overton by 3 inches, broader by 40 pounds, and dirtier by a lifetime. And none of that mattered because Overton had the clipboard and the badge and the backing of whatever phone call had sent him here. Who filed the report? Caleb asked. That's confidential. It's Mercer. Overton's pen stopped clicking. His smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. A flicker of confirmation he tried to suppress and couldn't. I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the complaint. You play poker with him on Thursdays. Mr. Harlan, I'm here to do an inspection. You can cooperate, or I can come back with a formal order and a sheriff's escort. Your choice. Caleb looked at Overton for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and swept his arm toward the garage interior. Help yourself. Overton walked through the shop with the clipboard like a doctor looking for disease. He checked the electrical panels. He measured the distance between the lifts and the walls. He looked at the fire extinguisher dates, the ventilation, the roof, the plumbing, the emergency exits. He photographed everything with his phone. He spent 7 minutes in the back office examining the space heater and the coffee pot and the filing cabinet as if any of those things contained evidence of a crime against municipal planning. Wade watched from Bay 2. Tommy watched from the donut box. Boyd, who had been working at a folding table near the back wall organizing paperwork for the fund, watched with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life assessing threats and has already categorized this one. When Overton finished, he stood by the front counter and made notes on the clipboard. He didn't look up when he spoke. I'm going to need to see your business license, your liability insurance, and your fire safety certification. There are a few items here that may need to be addressed. I'll file a preliminary report and you'll receive a formal notice within 10 business days. 10 business days, that's convenient. Excuse me? Caleb leaned against the counter. Mercer sends you in here on a fishing expedition 3 days after I walk into his shop and tell him what he is. You spend 40 minutes measuring my garage like it's a crime scene, and now I've got 10 business days of bureaucratic limbo hanging over my head. That's not a coincidence, Dale. That's a message. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you, and you can tell Mercer I received it. Overton put the clipboard under his arm. His smile had finally died. What replaced it was something smaller and colder, the expression of a man who knows he's being used as a tool and has decided he doesn't mind because the hand holding him is the one that signs his bonuses. "Have a good day, Mr. Harlan," he said, and he walked out. The sedan pulled away. Boyd appeared beside Caleb at the counter. "That wasn't random," Boyd said. "No." How connected is this, Mercer? Connected enough to send a county official into my shop within 72 hours of a conversation. Then he's going to get worse. I know. And you still want to do this. Caleb looked at the watch on the workbench. The second hand ticked, patient, relentless, not asking permission to keep moving. "I didn't start this because it was going to be easy," Caleb said. Boyd nodded. It was the slow nod of a man who's heard that sentence before, from sergeants, from captains, from men who were about to walk into places they might not walk out of. It was also the nod of a man who's decided he's going with them anyway. That night, Caleb sat alone in the back office with the space heater rattling and the watch on the desk and the unfinished letter to Caroline staring up at him like a wound that refused to scab. He picked up a pen. His hand hovered. The ink touched the paper. "Dear Caroline, I know you don't want to hear from me, but something happened this week that made me think of you. A little girl walked into my shop. She's 9. She did something brave and honest, and it reminded me of who you were before I broke things between us. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing because I realized I spent 20 years carrying your grandfather's watch and never once living up to what it said on the back." He stopped. "Read it again." The words looked pathetic on the page. Too late, too small, too much like a man trying to apologize for a fire by describing the smoke. But he didn't cross them out. He folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and wrote Caroline's last known address in Virginia on the front. Then he put a stamp on it and set it on the corner of the desk, where it sat like a lit fuse attached to something he couldn't see. He didn't mail it, not yet. He wasn't ready, and he wasn't sure she was either. The next morning brought trouble in a shape Caleb didn't expect. Rachel Whitaker was standing outside the garage when he arrived at 7. No Malibu this time. She'd walked. She was wearing the same denim jacket, a different server's uniform, and shoes that looked like they'd been repaired with glue and stubbornness. Her face was tight. Her arms were crossed. She was standing the way women stand when they're about to say something that costs them, and she didn't wait for him to park before she started. "What did you do?" she said. Caleb killed the engine and swung off the bike. "Good morning." "Don't. What did you say to Dwayne Mercer?" "How do you know about that?" "Because I got a call last night from my landlord telling me he's been contacted by the county assessor's office about the building's rental compliance, which has never happened before. And then Mrs. Chen downstairs told me Mercer's been asking around about who lives at the ridgeline and whether anyone has lease violations." The cold morning air sat between them like a wall. Caleb's stomach turned, not with surprise, but with confirmation. He'd known Mercer would retaliate. He hadn't known the direction. "He's coming after you because of me," Caleb said. "He's coming after me because you walked into his shop and poked a man who fights with paperwork, not fists. Men like you don't understand that. You think a confrontation is a thing you do face to face. Men like Mercer, they go sideways. They go through the people you care about. You didn't think. You went in there and felt righteous and strong and walked out feeling like you'd done something, and now my landlord is looking at my lease with new eyes, and I've got a 9-year-old daughter and 2 months of overdue rent and nowhere else to go." Her voice didn't break. It stayed level and hard and precise, and that was worse than breaking because it meant she'd had practice. It meant this wasn't her first time standing in a cold parking lot telling someone that their good intentions had made her life worse. Caleb stood there and took it. He didn't deflect. He didn't explain. He didn't offer money again because he'd already learned that particular door was locked. He just stood in the cold air with his helmet in his hand and let the truth of what she was saying settle into him like rainwater into cracked pavement. "You're right," he said. Rachel blinked. Whatever she'd expected him to say, that wasn't it. "I went to Mercer because I was angry. Not for you, for me. Because a man like that looked at your kid and saw a transaction, and it reminded me of every time I turned people into problems to solve instead of people to protect. I made it about my rage, not about your safety, and I'm sorry." The word hung in the air. Sorry. It's a word bikers don't use often, not because they don't feel it, but because most of them learned a long time ago that apologies without action are just noise dressed up in vowels. Rachel studied his face. She was looking for the lie, looking for the angle, looking for the thing that men always hide behind their eyes when they say the right words but mean something else. She didn't find it, and that seemed to unsettle her more than if she had. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I don't know yet. That's not good enough." "I know that too." She stood there for another moment, arms still crossed, jaw still set, the cold wind pulling at her denim jacket. Then something in her posture shifted, not softening exactly, but a slight release of the tension in her shoulders, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. "Maddie talks about you," she said. She told her whole class she met a biker who fixes motorcycles and has a watch from a war hero. My dad wasn't a hero, he just survived." "Same thing. When you're 9. Caleb almost smiled, almost. "How is she?" "She's fine. She asked me if we could come back and see the garage. I told her no." "Why?" Rachel looked at him the way a woman looks at a fire she's not sure is controlled. "Because the last thing she needs is another man who shows up, makes her feel safe, and then disappears." The sentence went through Caleb like a cold blade, not because it was cruel, because it was true, because it was exactly what he'd done to Caroline. Shown up, made her feel safe, and then disappeared behind road miles and silence, and the myth that distance was the same as protection. "I'm not going to disappear," he said. "You can't promise that." "No, I can't. But I can promise that whatever Mercer does next, it won't touch you or Maddie. Not through me. Not because of me." "How?" "Because I'm going to fix this. Not by going to his shop again. Not by making it about anger. I'm going to build something bigger than him. Something this town needs more than it needs a pawn shop." Rachel looked at him for a long time. The wind blew her hair across her face and she didn't push it back. "You sound like a man who just figured out what he's fighting for." "Maybe. Or a man who's about to get himself into something he can't get out of." "Maybe both." She uncrossed her arms, the first time since he'd pulled up. "If Mercer comes after my lease again, I need to know." "You'll know. And I'm not taking your money." "I know. And Maddie is not your second chance. She's my daughter, not your redemption project." "I know that too." Rachel turned and walked toward the street. Her shoes made a sound against the wet pavement that Caleb would remember for weeks. The particular rhythm of a woman walking away from help she needed but didn't trust. At the corner, she turned back. "Mr. Harlan." "Yeah." "The coffee at your garage really is terrible," Maddie told me. And then she was gone, walking east toward the Bluegrass Diner to work another double shift on feet that hurt, in shoes held together with glue, leaving behind the faint smell of diner grease and something else, the smallest, most tentative crack in a wall she'd spent years building. Caleb stood in the parking lot and watched her until she turned the corner and disappeared. Then he went inside and called Boyd. "We need to move faster," he said. "Why?" "Because Mercer's not just coming after me. He's going after her." Boyd was quiet for 3 seconds. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to the register Caleb remembered from the old days. The register that meant planning, not talking. "I'll make some calls," Boyd said. "How many people do you need?" "Enough to fill a garage." "When?" "Saturday." "That's 3 days." "I know." "You know what happens when you rush something like this? And you know what happens when you wait too long?" The line hummed. Boyd exhaled, the long, slow exhale of a man doing math with lives instead of numbers. "Saturday. I'll be there by noon. And Caleb?" "Yeah." "Mail the letter." The call ended. Caleb looked at the envelope on the desk. Caroline's name, Virginia address, a stamp, an unfinished bridge made of ink and paper and years of silence. He picked it up, walked to the mailbox on the corner of Pershing and Fifth, stood there with the envelope in his hand for 90 seconds, which is a long time when you're holding the first honest thing you've said to your daughter in 6 years. He opened the mailbox, put the letter inside, heard it drop. The metal lid clanged shut with a sound like a cell door closing, or opening, depending on which side you were standing on. He walked back to the garage. The neon sign buzzed, the Harleys gleamed, the watch ticked on the workbench. And across town, in a rented office above Cedar Street Pawn and Loan, Dwayne Mercer sat behind a desk with a phone in one hand and a printout of Caleb Harlan's property tax records in the other. He was talking to a man named Lowell Pratt, an attorney who specialized in code enforcement, property disputes, and the quiet destruction of small businesses that didn't cooperate with the people who ran Ash Creek's money. "I want him inspected again," Mercer said. "Electrical, plumbing, environmental, everything. And I want the Whitaker woman's landlord to know that the Ridgeline's fire suppression system hasn't been certified in 3 years." "That's going to cost," Pratt said. "I don't care what it costs. I care about what it buys. And what does it buy?" Mercer set down the printout and looked out the window at Cedar Street below, where the people of Ash Creek walked past his shop every day, some of them carrying things they'd rather keep but couldn't afford to, all of them potential customers, all of them one bad month away from his counter. "Silence," Mercer said. "The same thing it's always bought." But silence was the one thing Caleb Harlan was done selling. And on Saturday morning, when the sun came up cold and white over Ash Creek, Kentucky, the parking lot of Harlan Motorworks began to fill with a sound that Dwayne Mercer had never planned for. Motorcycles. One at first, a low, distant rumble from the west end of Pershing Street, then 2 more from the east, then a truck, then another bike, then 3 more trucks. By 9 o'clock, 17 Harleys sat in the lot, chrome catching the weak November sun, engines ticking as they cooled in the cold air. Pickup trucks lined the street. Men in leather vests and work boots stood in groups of 3 and 4, drinking coffee from paper cups, smoking, nodding at each other the way veterans do. No handshakes, no hugs, just the quiet acknowledgement that they were here because someone had called, and the call still meant something. Boyd stood by the bay doors with a clipboard, a different kind of clipboard than Overton's. This one had names, phone numbers, skills, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. A woman named Donna, who ran the only affordable daycare in the county. A retired school teacher named Jean, who'd been tutoring kids for free out of the public library for 8 years. A farmer named Holt, who had a truck and a chainsaw and nothing else to give, and had driven 40 minutes to give it. Caleb stood in the middle of his garage and looked at these people, broken, scarred, tired, proud, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not hope. Hope was too clean a word. It was closer to gravity. The sense that something heavy and real was pulling him toward ground he'd been flying over for years. Wade limped up beside him. "You ready?" "No." "Good. Means you're taking it seriously." Caleb took a breath, lit a cigarette, looked at the watch in his hand. His father's watch, ticking, steady, the engraving catching the light. Then he looked up at the room full of people who'd come because a 61-year-old biker had asked for help and meant it. He opened his mouth to speak, and then his phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He looked down. The message was 3 sentences, and each one hit him like a round to the chest. "Mr. Harlan, this is Rachel Whitaker. Mercer's lawyer just contacted my landlord with a formal eviction filing. We have 14 days. Caleb's hand closed around the watch so hard the broken chain bit into his palm. He looked up at the room, at Boyd, at Wade, at 17 Harleys and a garage full of people who still believed that doing the right thing mattered. 14 days. And Mercer had just declared war on a woman whose only crime was raising a daughter with more honor than his entire life had ever earned. Caleb put the phone in his pocket. He didn't tell the room, not yet. Instead, he looked at Boyd and said 2 words that both of them recognized from a lifetime ago. Words that meant the mission had changed, the timeline had collapsed, and there was no longer any version of this where walking away was an option. "Contact front." Boyd's eyes hardened. He set down the clipboard. And every man in that garage who'd ever worn a uniform felt the air change, felt the room shift from gathering to operation, from intention to necessity, from the luxury of planning to the urgency of a fight that was no longer coming. It was already here. Caleb didn't tell them about the text for 11 minutes. 11 minutes of standing in front of a room full of people who'd driven through cold November roads to be here, holding a phone in his pocket with a countdown on it, like a grenade with the pin already pulled. He let Boyd start the introductions. He let Wade pass out coffee. He let Tommy shake hands with the farmer named Holt and the retired teacher named Jean and the daycare woman named Donna, who had kind eyes and calloused hands and a voice that sounded like she'd spent 30 years talking to children who needed someone steady. Caleb watched it all happening, the handshakes, the nods, the quiet sizing up that men and women do when they're deciding whether to trust a room, and he felt the phone burning against his thigh like a piece of shrapnel he couldn't remove without bleeding. Then Boyd looked at him across the garage. One look, the kind of look that passes between men who've shared foxholes and bad orders, and the particular silence that comes after someone doesn't come back. Boyd's eyes said, "Whatever you're holding, put it on the table." Caleb pulled out the phone. He held it up so the screen faced the room. He didn't read the text aloud. He just said, 14 days. 14 days for what? Donna asked. The woman whose daughter started all this. Rachel Whitaker. She's being evicted. Mercer's lawyer filed the paperwork last night. 14 days to vacate or face legal removal. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable silence of men at rest. The hard silence of people doing math they don't like. On what grounds? Boyd asked. Doesn't matter what grounds. Mercer owns the building through a shell company. I'd bet my garage on it. Even if he doesn't, his lawyer is tight with the landlord and the county assessor. He doesn't need real grounds. He needs 14 days of pressure and a woman too exhausted to fight back. So this isn't about you, Boyd said. It was never about me. I just didn't figure that out until it was too late. Wade leaned forward on the milk crate, his prosthetic clicking against the concrete. He's using her as leverage. Punish the woman, scare the biker, kill the fun before it starts. That's the playbook, Caleb said. Holt, the farmer, stood near the back with his arms crossed and his John Deere cap pushed back on his head. He was 53, built like a post, and had the quiet intensity of a man who'd spent his life fighting weather and banks and the slow erosion of everything he'd inherited. I came here because my wife said I should. She heard about the watch story from somebody at the feed store. I figured I'd show up, donate some time, help fix a roof or carry some groceries. I didn't figure I'd be walking into a war. Nobody's asking you to fight a war, Caleb said. You're asking us to stand between a pawn shop owner with political connections and a single mother with 14 days. That's not community service. That's a siege. Then leave. Holt stared at Caleb. The room held its breath. I didn't say I was leaving, Holt said. I said I didn't figure on it. There's a difference. Caleb nodded. Something passed between them. Not friendship, not alliance, but recognition. The recognition that comes when two men who've been beaten by systems larger than themselves decide, independently and without discussion, that being beaten again is preferable to watching someone else take the hit. What do we know about Mercer's operation? Boyd asked. He'd moved to the folding table and was already writing on a legal pad. War footing. The shift was automatic, decades of training converting shock into structure, emotion into logistics. Cedar Street Pawn and Loan, been open since 2006. He buys low, sells high, and uses the margin to buy influence. He's tight with Dale Overton at the county assessor's office and at least 2 town council members. His lawyer is Lowell Pratt. Property disputes, code enforcement, the kind of legal work that doesn't make headlines but ruins lives. Does he have anything criminal? Nothing that stuck. There were rumors about predatory lending practices a few years ago, but nobody filed charges. The people he hurts can't afford lawyers. Tommy Cahill spoke up from the donut box. My cousin's ex-wife sold her engagement ring there after the divorce. Said he offered $200 for something worth $1,200. When she pushed back, he told her she could take the $200 or come back when she was more motivated. Her words. That's not criminal, Boyd said. That's just ugly. Everything Mercer does is just ugly enough to be legal, Caleb said. That's his whole game. He doesn't break laws. He bends them around people's necks until they stop breathing. Donna cleared her throat. She'd been standing near the pegboard tools, arms folded, listening with the patient attention of a woman who spent decades managing rooms full of chaos. The Whitaker girl, Maddie, she's in my after-school program. Has been since September. Smart kid. Quiet. Eats everything on the plate like she's not sure there'll be another one. The sentence went through the room like voltage. Caleb felt it in his chest. That particular tightening that happens when you realize a child is hungry and nobody noticed. Rachel picks her up at 5:30, Donna continued. She's always the last one there, always apologizing for being late. Tips me $1 from her tip jar every Friday, which I don't ask for and she can't afford. I'm telling you this because you need to understand who you're protecting. This isn't a concept. This is a woman and a child, and they are real, and they are running out of time. Boyd looked up from his legal pad. 14 days. What's the legal angle? I know a guy, Wade said. Pro bono lawyer out of Louisville. Does tenants' rights work. Name's Hargrove. I can call him. Call him now. Wade pulled out his phone and limped toward the office for quiet. Boyd turned to Caleb. What else aren't you telling me? Caleb met his eyes. The question was pointed, and Boyd knew it. In the old days, Caleb had a habit of holding back the worst piece of information until it was too late to plan around it, not out of deception, but out of some broken instinct that told him carrying the weight alone was the same as protecting the people around him. That instinct had cost them in Reno. It had cost them before that. And Boyd's eyes said he wasn't going to let it cost them again. The letter, Caleb said. What about it? I mailed it. To Caroline. Good. It's not good. I told her about the fund, about the watch, about what I'm trying to do. If Mercer starts digging, if Pratt starts looking into my background, my history, my family, they'll find Caroline. They'll find out I haven't spoken to my daughter in 6 years. They'll find the custody hearing. They'll find the DUI from 2014. They'll find the year I spent riding with the scorched iron out of Louisville before I came home. The room shifted. Boyd set down the pen. Tommy put down the donut. Holt uncrossed his arms. Even Donna looked at Caleb differently. Not with judgment, but with the recalibrated attention of someone realizing the man asking for their trust has rooms they haven't seen yet. Scorched iron, Boyd said. The name landed like a dropped engine block. You rode with the scorched iron. 14 months after the divorce, after Caroline stopped talking to me. I was in a bad place, and they had a chapter in Louisville that didn't ask questions. They're a 1%er club, Caleb. I know what they are. Did you patch in? Prospect only. I never took the full patch. I left before the vote. Why? Because they asked me to do something I wouldn't do, and I rode away in the middle of the night and spent 3 months looking over my shoulder. Boyd stared at him. The legal pad sat forgotten on the table. What did they ask you to do? Doesn't matter. It matters if Mercer's lawyer finds out. It matters if Pratt pulls court records or police files or club intelligence and finds your name connected to a 1%er outfit. You know how that plays in a small town. You know what it does to everything we're building here. That's why I'm telling you now. You should have told me before I drove 3 hours. If I'd told you before, would you have come? Boyd didn't answer. He picked up the pen. He tapped it against the legal pad 3 times, a rhythm Caleb recognized from the old days, the sound Boyd made when he was angry but choosing to be useful instead. What else? Boyd asked. That's everything. That's everything you're willing to tell me. There's a difference. Boyd, 14 months with the scorched iron, a DUI, a destroyed marriage, a daughter who won't speak to you, and now a pawn shop owner with political connections trying to evict a single mother because you decided to play hero. That's what I drove 3 hours into. Yes. Boyd exhaled through his nose, long and slow. The exhale of a man calculating whether the mission is worth the cost and arriving at a number that hurts but doesn't disqualify. All right, he said. Then we do it clean. We do it legal. We do it loud enough that Mercer can't bury it and quiet enough that we don't give Pratt ammunition. And you, he pointed the pen at Caleb like a weapon. You tell me everything from now on, before it hits, not after. Agreed. And if the scorched iron comes up, it won't. If it does, Caleb's jaw worked beneath his beard. If it does, I handle it, alone. Like hell you do. The garage fell silent again. 2 old soldiers staring at each other across a folding table with a legal pad and a dead man's watch between them, both of them knowing that the thing they were building had just gotten heavier and more dangerous and more necessary all at the same time. Wade came back from the office. His face had changed. He was carrying the phone at his side like it weighed 10 pounds. "Hargrove can't take the case," he said. "Why?" "Because Lowell Pratt is his former partner. They shared a practice in Louisville for 6 years before Hargrove went pro bono. He says there's a conflict of interest. He also said something else." "What?" Wade looked at Caleb, then at Boyd, then at the room. "He said Pratt doesn't take cases like this for money. He takes them for favors. And the last 3 tenants Pratt helped evict from buildings connected to Mercer's shell company. All of them were people who'd complained about Mercer to local authorities or the Better Business Bureau." The room went completely still. "He's not just retaliating against Rachel," Boyd said slowly. "He's got a pattern." "Hargrove said he's seen at least 3 cases in the last 4 years. Same playbook. Tenant complains or crosses Mercer. Pratt files a code violation or lease technicality. County assessor backs it up. Tenant is out within 60 days, no media coverage, no legal challenge. Nobody fights back because nobody can afford to." 3 families, Donna said, "in 4 years." "At least 3. Hargrove thinks there are more, but he can't prove it without access to Mercer's property records." Caleb leaned against the workbench. The watch ticked beside his elbow. He thought about Maddie standing in his doorway with a wet cardboard box and enormous brown eyes. He thought about Rachel walking through the cold to confront him in his own parking lot, her shoes held together with glue. He thought about 3 families, at least 3, erased from their homes by a man who'd built a system so quiet and legal and ruthless that nobody even noticed it working. And he thought about his father, Staff Sergeant Davis Harlan, who carried a watch through a war zone inside a boot because his pockets were gone, who came home and opened a garage and fixed machines for people who couldn't afford dealership prices, who engraved 6 words on the back of a watch and lived by every single one of them until the day he died. Do right when no one is watching. "We need those records," Caleb said. "They're not public," Boyd said. "The property transfers are. Shell companies file with the state. Ownership records are searchable through the county clerk's office." "That requires someone who knows how to navigate county records." Gene, the retired schoolteacher, raised his hand. Not dramatically, just a slight lift, the way a student would in a classroom. He was 68, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the deliberate posture of a man who'd spent 40 years standing in front of rooms full of people who didn't want to be there. "I volunteer at the county library," he said. "The public records terminal is in the basement. I've used it before for genealogy research, property records, corporate filings, tax assessments. They're all searchable if you know the query structure." Boyd looked at him. "Can you do it quietly?" "I'm a retired schoolteacher who does genealogy in a library basement. I am, by definition, quiet." Nobody laughed, but something loosened in the room. The tension didn't break. It redistributed, spreading from Caleb's shoulders across the group like a load being shared for the first time. "Gene searches the records," Boyd said, writing on the legal pad. "We need a timeline of Mercer's property acquisitions, shell companies, and eviction patterns. Wade, find another lawyer. Not Louisville. Try Lexington or Frankfurt. Someone who's never heard of Lowell Pratt. Donna, keep an eye on Maddie at the after-school program. If anything changes in that kid's behavior, we need to know." "Tommy, I know people at the county clerk's office," Tommy said. "My sister works the front desk. She won't pull files for us, but she'll tell us if someone else has been pulling files on Caleb." Boyd nodded. "Good. And Holt?" The farmer looked up from beneath his John Deere cap. "I've got a truck and a chainsaw and not much else." "Can you fix a roof?" "I can fix anything that sits still long enough." "Then you might be fixing the Ridgeline's fire suppression issues before Mercer uses them as ammunition." Holt nodded. One nod. The nod of a man who's just been given a mission small enough to carry and large enough to matter. Caleb watched Boyd work. He'd forgotten this. The way Boyd turned chaos into order, turned fear into tasks, turned a room full of isolated people into a unit. It was the same thing he'd done in the service, the same thing he'd done in the old riding days, the same thing that had made him irreplaceable and that Reno had nearly destroyed. Watching it happen again felt like watching a broken bone reset. Painful, necessary, and terrifying in its precision. By noon, the garage had emptied. The Harleys and trucks had dispersed across Ash Creek and the surrounding county, each person carrying a piece of the plan like runners in a relay they hadn't trained for. Caleb stood alone in the quiet garage with Boyd, the watch, and 2 mugs of cold coffee. "You know this isn't going to stay clean," Boyd said. "I know. Mercer's going to find out what we're doing. He's going to find out about the scorched iron. He's going to use everything he has." "I know." "And you're okay with that?" "No, I'm not okay with any of it, but I'm done being the man who rides away." Boyd picked up his jacket from the folding table. He shrugged it on, and his shoulder clicked, and he winced in a way that he tried to hide and couldn't. "I'll be back Monday. I've got calls to make and a shoulder that's telling me I'm too old for this." "We're both too old for this." "Yeah, but the people who should be doing it aren't, so here we are." Boyd walked to his truck. He stopped at the driver's door and turned back. "Caleb." "Yeah." "The thing the scorched iron asked you to do. The thing you wouldn't do. The thing that made you leave. What about it?" "Was it about a woman?" Caleb didn't answer. He stood in the bay door with his hands in his pockets and the gray November light falling on his face, and the silence between them was so heavy it had its own gravitational field. "Was it about a kid?" Boyd asked. Caleb's eyes closed. When they opened, they were wet. Not crying. Men like Caleb Harlan had lost the mechanism for that somewhere between deployment and divorce. But wet, the way eyes get when the body tries to release something the mind won't allow. "They wanted me to look the other way," Caleb said. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "There was a house outside Louisville, kids inside. The chapter president had a deal with the man who ran it. I was supposed to ride past and keep my mouth shut. That was the test. That was how you earned the patch." Boyd stood very still. "I didn't ride past," Caleb said. "I stopped. I went to the door, and what I found inside—" He stopped. His throat closed around the words like a fist. "I called the police from a payphone 2 miles down the road. Anonymous. Didn't leave a name. Didn't wait. Just called and rode. 3 kids. The youngest was 5. They were removed that night. The man was arrested. The chapter president figured out it was me within a week. I left town on a Tuesday with nothing but the bike and the watch and a target on my back that took 3 months to fade." "You never told anyone." "Who was I going to tell? I was a prospect for a 1%er club. The cops would have arrested me. My ex-wife would have used it in court. Caroline would have—" He stopped again. Drew breath like it cost money. "I did the right thing. Once. In the worst possible way. At the worst possible time. And it cost me everything I had left. And the thing that kept me up at night wasn't the danger. It was the fact that for 14 months before that night, I rode past that house and didn't stop." The wind blew through the open bay door and scattered a paper cup across the concrete floor. Boyd didn't move. His face held that expression soldiers get when they hear something that rearranges the architecture of what they thought they knew about a man. Not shock exactly, but recalibration. The internal gears clicking into a new alignment. "That's why you stopped for Maddie," Boyd said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't know that until she walked through the door, but yeah, that's why." Boyd got in his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. Then he started it, and the cracked windshield caught the gray light, and he pulled out of the lot without saying goodbye, which was how men like Boyd said, "I'm with you." Caleb went back inside. The garage was cold. The space heater rattled. The watch ticked on the workbench. He picked it up and held it in his palm and stared at the engraving until the letters blurred. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Rachel's number. "Maddie wants to know if you're okay. She said you looked sad when we left." Caleb stared at the screen. A 9-year-old girl walking through a storm to return a watch. A 9-year-old girl asking a stranger if he's okay. A 9-year-old girl who didn't know that the man she'd given the watch back to had once ridden past a house full of children and kept going, and that the shame of that silence had defined every hollow day since. He typed back, "Tell her I'm working on it." Then he put the phone down, picked up the pen, and started writing. Not the letter to Caroline. That one was already gone. Already traveling through the postal system toward Virginia, already carrying his inadequate words toward a daughter who might throw it away unopened. This was something new, a list. Names, dates, properties, everything he remembered about Mercer's operations, everything Tommy's sister might confirm, everything Jean might find in the basement of the county library. At the top of the page, he wrote 3 words: Ash Creek Honesty Fund. And beneath that, smaller, in handwriting that shook slightly because the hand holding the pen belonged to a man who was terrified of what he was about to do. For Maddie, for Caroline, for the ones I rode past. He worked until midnight. The garage grew dark around him except for the desk lamp and the neon sign bleeding red through the office window. At 12:15 his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Harlan? A man's voice, smooth, professional, the kind of voice that charges $400 an hour. Who is this? My name is Lowell Pratt. I represent Cedar Street Pawn and Loan and its affiliated property holdings. I'm calling as a courtesy. Courtesy? I understand you've been organizing some kind of community effort at your garage. I want you to know that any activities that violate your property's commercial zoning designation could result in additional citations. I also want you to know that any interference with pending legal proceedings, specifically the Whitaker eviction, could be construed as obstruction. Caleb's grip tightened on the phone. Is that a threat? It's information. I deal in information, Mr. Harlan. For example, I have information about a 14-month period in your history that involves an association with a certain motorcycle organization based in Louisville. I have information about anonymous tips to law enforcement. I have information about a custody hearing in 2016 where that association was raised as evidence of parental unfitness. The room turned cold. Not the heater dying, something else. The particular cold that comes when a man realizes his worst secret is in someone else's hands. You've been digging, Caleb said. I've been researching. There's a difference. And research, Mr. Harlan, is what I do. What do you want? I want you to stop, close the fund, cancel Saturday's gathering. Let the Whitaker matter proceed through normal legal channels. Go back to fixing motorcycles. That's what you're good at. And if I don't, then the research becomes public. The scorched iron connection, the custody records, the details of why you left Louisville in the middle of the night. All of it. Not in a courtroom. In a town. In the mouths of neighbors. In the minds of every person who showed up at your garage today thinking they were following a good man. Caleb stood up. The chair rolled backward and hit the filing cabinet. The watch fell off the desk and hit the floor. The second hand kept ticking. You're threatening to destroy me to protect a man who steals from children. I'm advising a client. That's my job. And Mr. Harlan, I should tell you that this conversation is not being recorded, so anything you say right now exists only between us, including whatever creative response you're formulating. Here's my response, Pratt. You tell Mercer that I spent 14 months riding with men who thought fear was the same thing as respect. I know what threats look like. I know what they cost. And I know that the men who make them are always more afraid than the men they're making them to. Because men who aren't afraid don't need lawyers to make phone calls at midnight. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. 14 days, Mr. Harlan, Pratt said. That's how long Ms. Whitaker has, and that's how long you have to decide what kind of man you really are. The call ended. Caleb stood in the dark office with the phone in his hand and the watch on the floor and the list of names on the desk and the unfinished life behind him and the impossible road ahead. He bent down and picked up the watch. The crystal wasn't cracked. The second hand ticked. The engraving was still there. 6 words that had outlasted 2 wars, a dead father, a broken marriage, an abandoned daughter, 14 months of cowardice, 1 night of courage, and a pawn shop owner who thought silence could be purchased. He put the watch in his pocket. He sat back down. He picked up the pen, and on the list beneath the names and dates and properties, he wrote 1 more line. The line that changed everything. The line that meant there was no more hiding, no more riding away, no more choosing the safe dark over the dangerous light. Go public. Saturday. Tell them everything. All of it. The fund, the scorched iron, the house in Louisville. The night I stopped. The years I didn't. Let them decide. His hand stopped shaking. The pen was still. The watch ticked in his pocket against his ribs, and for the first time in 14 months, no, for the first time in years, Caleb Harlan wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of what would happen if he kept running from it. And somewhere in the dark, at the other end of a phone line that no longer connected them, Lowell Pratt dialed another number and said to the man who answered, "He's not stopping." And Dwayne Mercer, sitting in his office above the pawn shop with a glass of bourbon and a stack of property records, said, "Then we take the garage." Saturday came like a blade, cold, sharp. The kind of November morning where the sky is the color of gunmetal and the air tastes like iron, and the whole world feels like it's holding its breath before something breaks. Caleb was at the garage by 5:30, 3 hours before anyone was supposed to arrive. He hadn't slept. The desk lamp was still on from last night, and the legal pad with the list that ended with the words, "Go public." Tell them everything. Sat exactly where he'd left it, the ink already drying into permanence. He made coffee. The pot gurgled. The space heater rattled. The neon sign outside hummed its dying red into the pre-dawn dark. Caleb stood at the workbench and drank from the same stained mug and smoked a Pall Mall down to the filter and thought about what he was about to do. Not the fund, not the plan, the confession. The full, uncut, no-exit ramp confession of who he'd been, where he'd been, and what he'd done and failed to do during the 14 worst months of his life. He thought about the faces that would be in the room: Boyd, Wade, Tommy, Donna, Jean, Holt, maybe others. Boyd had made calls all week, and the number kept shifting upward like a tide nobody could measure. These were people who had shown up because they believed in something. And in 2 hours, he was going to stand in front of them and tell them the man they'd believed in had once ridden with a one-percenter club, had a DUI on his record, had lost custody of his daughter, and had spent 14 months driving past a house full of endangered children before finding the nerve to stop. The coffee tasted like regret. It always did. At 6:15, his phone buzzed. "Boyd, Jean found something. Get to the garage. Don't call anyone else yet." Caleb was already at the garage. He texted back, "I'm here." Boyd arrived at 6:40 in the rust-colored F250, and Jean was in the passenger seat. The retired school teacher climbed out carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke a mailbox. His wire-rimmed glasses were smudged. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the particular tremor that comes from spending 18 hours in a library basement staring at property records on a screen designed in 1997. They went inside. Boyd poured Jean a coffee. Jean set the folder on the workbench and opened it, and the three of them stood in the fluorescent light and looked at what the quiet man with the genealogy hobby had pulled from the public record. "Mercer doesn't own one building," Jean said. His voice was steady, methodical, the voice of a man who'd spent 4 decades organizing information for teenagers who didn't want it. "He owns 9, through 3 shell companies registered to a P.O. box in Frankfurt. The companies are called Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, Cedar Capital Partners, and Bluegrass Property Trust. All 3 list the same registered agent, Lowell Pratt." Boyd took the folder and started flipping pages. His eyes moved fast, military fast. The Ridgeline Apartments, where Rachel lives, are owned by Ridgeline Holdings. So is the building that houses the tax preparation office next to the pawn shop. So is a strip of rental units on Oak Street that includes a laundromat, a hair salon, and a vacant storefront that used to be a children's clothing shop. "Used to be," Caleb said. "Closed 8 months ago." The owner, a woman named Patricia Delane, was evicted for lease violations. I found the filing. Same pattern. Code complaint, assessor involvement, Pratt handling the legal work. "That's 4 evictions," Boyd said. "At minimum." 5. Jean pulled a separate sheet from the folder. "There's one more. A family named Rojas, lived in the Oak Street units for 7 years. Evicted 14 months ago after the father filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau about Mercer's lending practices. The complaint was dismissed. The family was out within 60 days. Caleb stared at the paperwork. Names, dates, addresses, filing numbers. The machinery of a man who'd turned a pawn shop into a quiet empire of leverage, using property ownership and political connections to remove anyone who challenged him, one family at a time, without ever raising his voice or getting his hands dirty. "This is a pattern," Boyd said. "This is prosecutable." "Maybe," Jean said. If someone files, if someone investigates, if the county assessor's office isn't compromised, that's a lot of ifs. Then we take the ifs out of it, Caleb said. We go public, today. Not just the fund, all of it. The shell companies, the evictions, the pattern. We put it in front of the town and let them see what Mercer's been doing. Boyd set down the folder. And then you tell them about yourself. Yes. The scorched iron, the DUI, all of it. All of it. You understand what happens then. You give Mercer the ammunition yourself. Pratt doesn't need to leak anything. You hand it over in public and let the town decide whether the man delivering the message is worth listening to. I know. And if they decide you're not, then at least they'll have the information. The fund doesn't need me to survive. It needs to exist. Boyd looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up the legal pad and tore off the page with the list and put it in his jacket pocket. I'll organize the information. Jean, can you make copies? Already made them, 12 sets. They're in my car. Then let's get this room ready. By 8:30, the garage was full. Not just the original group. Boyd's calls had multiplied like ripples, and each ripple brought someone new. A nurse named Clara, who worked the night shift at the county hospital, and had seen Rachel bring Maddie in for a fever 3 months ago and pay the copay in quarters. A mechanic from 2 towns over named Judd, who'd lost his own shop to a landlord dispute in 2019 and had been working out of his truck ever since. 2 women from the Bluegrass Diner, servers who worked with Rachel and knew what double shifts on bad feet felt like. A retired county clerk named Faye who'd processed Mercer's property filings for years and had always thought something about them smelled wrong but never had anyone to tell. 27 people. In a garage built for machines, not movements. They stood between the lifts and the workbenches, holding paper cups of coffee, their breath visible in the cold air because the space heater couldn't handle a crowd this size. Some of them knew each other, most didn't, but they were all there for the same reason. Because someone had called and the call meant something, and in a town like Ash Creek, where the systems that were supposed to protect people had been quietly hollowed out from the inside, sometimes the only thing left was a room full of strangers deciding to stop being strangers. Caleb stood at the front of the garage. The bay doors were open behind him, framing the cold November sky and the row of Harleys parked outside, their chrome catching the weak morning light. The watch sat on the workbench beside him, ticking, visible, the engraving facing up. He didn't have a speech. Men like Caleb Harlan didn't write speeches. They said what they meant or they said nothing, and the space between those 2 options was where most of their lives had been lived. I'm not going to waste your time, he said. His voice carried through the garage. Rough, low, the voice of a man who'd smoked too many cigarettes and swallowed too many words. You know why you're here. You know about the watch. You know about Maddie Whitaker. You know what I'm trying to build. I want to talk about that. But first I need to talk about something else. I need to talk about me. The room shifted. People adjusted their weight. Coffee cups paused halfway to mouths. 3 days ago, a lawyer named Lowell Pratt called me at midnight and told me that if I didn't stop, he'd make my past public. He has information about me that he thinks will destroy what we're building. And he's right. It might. So I'm going to tell you myself, right now, before he gets the chance. Boyd stood near the folding table with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Wade sat on the milk crate with his prosthetic legs stretched out. Donna stood near the pegboard tools. Jean held his manila folder. They all knew what was coming. The rest of the room didn't. When I was 46 years old, my marriage ended. It ended because I was an absent father and a selfish husband who thought road miles were the same as freedom. My wife left. My daughter stopped speaking to me. I got a DUI 8 months later. Blew a .11 on Route 12 on a Tuesday afternoon because I'd been drinking since breakfast and didn't see a reason to stop. Lost my license for 6 months. Almost lost this garage. The room was silent. Not comfortable silence, the hard witnessing silence of people hearing something they weren't prepared for. After the DUI, I left Ash Creek. I rode to Louisville. I fell in with a motorcycle club called the Scorched Iron. They were a 1%er outfit, not the kind of club I'm building here, not protectors, not veterans helping veterans. They were hard men doing hard things, and I joined them because I wanted to disappear into something louder than my own shame. He paused, lit a cigarette. His hands were steady, but the match shook, just enough for the people in the front row to notice. I prospected for 14 months. That means I did what I was told, rode where I was told, kept my mouth shut when I was told. And then one night, they told me to ride past a house on the outskirts of Louisville, a house where children were being hurt. The chapter president had an arrangement with the man who lived there. My job was to look the other way. That was the final test. That was how I earned my patch. The silence in the garage became something physical. A pressure against the walls, against the ceiling, against the chests of every person standing in it. I didn't ride past. I stopped. I went to the door. And what I found inside that house, his voice cracked. Not dramatically, not performatively, the way a beam cracks when it's been holding weight too long. I called the police from a payphone 2 miles down the road. 3 children were removed that night. The man was arrested, and I rode out of Louisville in the dark with nothing but this watch and a target on my back. He took a breath. The cigarette burned between his fingers. That's who I am. A man who did the wrong thing for 14 months and the right thing for 1 night. A man who lost his daughter because he chose silence over presence. A man with a DUI and a 1%er history and a garage that's about to get inspected into oblivion by a county assessor who works for a pawn shop owner. That's the man asking you to help build something good in this town. And if that's not the kind of man you want leading this, I understand. The fund doesn't need my name on it. It just needs to exist. He stopped talking. The cigarette had burned to the filter. He dropped it on the concrete and stepped on it and stood there with his hands at his sides, exposed, stripped, every door open, every room visible, waiting for the room to decide whether the man standing in front of them was worth following or walking away from. The silence lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds is an eternity when you're standing naked in your own garage waiting for a verdict. Then Donna spoke. She didn't step forward. She didn't raise her hand. She just spoke from where she stood, near the pegboard tools, with her calm voice and her calloused hands and her 30 years of steady, unshakable authority. I've been running a daycare for 28 years, she said. I've seen men who hurt children and men who look away and men who call themselves good while doing nothing. And in all those years, the only men I've ever trusted are the ones who can stand in a room and say what you just said. Because the ones who pretend they've never failed are the ones you need to worry about. Holt removed his cap. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. The nod of a farmer who's heard enough and made his decision. Clara, the nurse, said, I saw Rachel Whitaker pay a hospital copay in quarters, $37 in quarters from a mason jar in her purse. I've thought about that jar every day since. So if you're telling me a man with a bad past wants to make sure that woman never has to pay in quarters again, I'm in. One by one, not dramatically, not with applause, just with nods and quiet words and the particular settling of a room that's decided to move forward together. Wade knocked his prosthetic against the concrete floor twice, an old signal from the service that meant acknowledged, proceeding. Tommy raised his coffee cup. Gene adjusted his glasses and held up the manila folder. And Boyd just looked at Caleb across the room with an expression that wasn't surprise and wasn't pride, but was something rarer. The recognition that a man he'd known for 30 years had just done the hardest thing a man can do, and it hadn't killed him. Not yet. Boyd stepped forward with the folder. Now that we know who we are, he said, let me tell you what we're up against. He opened the folder and began laying Gene's research on the workbench. Property records, shell company filings, eviction timelines, assessor involvement, the whole architecture of Mercer's quiet empire spread out like a map of a war zone nobody knew existed. The room leaned in. 27 people reading paperwork, 27 people seeing the pattern. And when they saw it, when they understood that the man who'd offered a 9-year-old girl $40 for a stolen watch was the same man who'd quietly displaced 5 families from their homes in 4 years using the legal system as a weapon. The energy in the room changed, not to anger, something colder, something more focused, the energy of people who've been shown a machine and are now looking for the gears. The eviction filing against Rachel Whitaker is the 6th documented case, Boyd said. Same shell company, same lawyer, same assessor involvement. The difference this time is that Rachel has something the others didn't. What's that? Holt asked. A room full of people who know what's happening. At 11:15, Caleb's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered on speaker, standing in the middle of the garage with 27 people watching. Mr. Harlan. Pratt's voice filled the room, smooth, professional, untouchable. I understand you had quite the gathering this morning. Word travels fast. In small towns, it does. I'm calling to inform you that my client has filed an emergency inspection request with the county assessor's office. Your property will be inspected Monday morning for electrical code violations, environmental hazards, and potential zoning infractions. If violations are found, and they will be found, you'll receive a cease and desist order within 48 hours. You're on speaker, Pratt. A pause. 3 seconds. The sound of a man recalculating. I see, Pratt said. Then let me be clear for your audience. This is not personal. This is a legal process. My client has every right to request inspections through proper channels, and the county has every obligation to enforce its codes. If your property is in compliance, you have nothing to worry about. Boyd stepped forward. Mr. Pratt, this is Boyd Maddox. I'm handling logistics for the Ash Creek Honesty Fund. I'd like to inform you that we've obtained public records documenting your client's property holdings through 3 shell companies: Ridgeline Holdings, Cedar Capital Partners, and Bluegrass Property Trust. We've also documented 5 prior evictions from properties owned by these entities, all following the same pattern of code complaints, assessor involvement, and your legal representation. These records are public, and we intend to share them publicly with every media outlet, county official, and civic organization in the region. The phone was silent for 6 seconds. 6 seconds of a lawyer hearing his own architecture described back to him by a man with a clipboard and a flat-top buzz cut and the steady voice of someone who's organized supply lines under fire. Those records are public, Pratt said, and they prove nothing. They prove a pattern, Boyd said, and patterns are what journalists look for. Are you threatening my client, Mr. Maddox? I'm informing you. There's a difference. You called us at midnight to inform us. We're returning the courtesy. The line went dead. Pratt hung up without saying goodbye. The room exhaled. Not with relief, with the charged electric awareness that comes after a shot has been fired and you're waiting to see where it lands. He's going to escalate, Caleb said. He already has, Boyd said. Monday morning inspection. That gives us 2 days. 2 days for what? To make sure this garage passes every inspection they throw at it, and to get the Whitaker eviction in front of a judge who isn't in Mercer's pocket. Wade stood up from the milk crate. I found a lawyer, Frankfurt. Name's Colleen Marsh, tenants' rights, housing discrimination, pattern of conduct cases. She's never heard of Lowell Pratt, and she's angry. Angry about what? About everything I told her. She said if we can document the pattern, if Jean's records hold up, she can file for an emergency injunction to halt the Whitaker eviction and open a broader investigation into Mercer's property practices. How fast? She needs the records by tonight. She'll file Monday morning, same time Overton shows up to inspect the garage. Boyd looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Boyd. The same thought passed between them without words. This is it. This is the wall. Everything we've built comes down to 2 days and a stack of paperwork and whether 27 people in a cold garage can outrun a man with a lawyer and a county assessor and 40 years of accumulated silence. All right, Caleb said, let's go to work. What happened next would become the story that Ash Creek told itself for years afterward. Not the big story, not the dramatic version, but the real one. The one about the 36 hours between Saturday noon and Monday morning when a garage full of strangers became something else. Holt and Judd spent Saturday afternoon on the roof of Harlan Motorworks, replacing damaged shingles and sealing the leak in Bay 3 that Caleb had been ignoring for 2 years. Wade crawled under the electrical panels with a flashlight and a voltmeter and rewired 3 junction boxes that were technically out of code, muttering about fire hazards and stubborn old men who treat their garages like their garages treat them, with neglect and loyalty in equal measure. Tommy's sister at the county clerk's office confirmed that Pratt had pulled Caleb's property records 3 times in the past week: tax assessments, inspection history, zoning classification. She also confirmed that Dale Overton had signed off on a rush inspection order at 4:47 p.m. on Friday, which meant the bureaucratic machinery was already in motion before Pratt's phone call. Jean drove to Frankfurt with 3 copies of the manila folder and met Colleen Marsh in the parking lot of a Waffle House at 9:30 Saturday night. He handed her the records. She read them in the car while he ate hash browns and drank coffee and waited with the patience of a man who'd spent 40 years waiting for teenagers to finish standardized tests. At 10:15, Marsh looked up from the folder and said, "This is enough." Enough for what? Enough to file. Enough to get a judge to look. Maybe enough to stop the eviction and open an investigation. She paused. But I need one more thing. What? I need Rachel Whitaker to agree to be the named plaintiff. I can't file on her behalf without her consent, and I need it by Monday morning. Jean called Caleb. Caleb called Boyd. Boyd called Donna. Donna called Rachel. Rachel didn't answer. Donna called again. No answer. Again. No answer. 4 calls in 20 minutes, each one landing in voicemail. Each voicemail a quiet plea from a woman who ran a daycare and had never begged for anything in her life. Rachel, please call me back. It's important. It's about Maddie. At 11:40, Rachel called back. Her voice was thin and hollow, the voice of a woman who'd been crying alone in a dark apartment after her daughter went to sleep. They raised the rent, Rachel said. I got a letter tonight, effective immediately. The landlord says it's a market adjustment, $200 more a month, on top of the eviction filing, on top of everything. Donna closed her eyes. She was sitting in the garage office, in Caleb's creaking chair, with the space heater rattling and the watch ticking on the desk, and the smell of coffee and motor oil, and decades of silent work surrounding her like a cocoon. Rachel, listen to me. There's a lawyer. She can help. But she needs you to say yes. Yes to what? To fighting. The line was quiet. The space heater rattled. The watch ticked. I'm so tired, Donna. I know. I work doubles 6 days a week. I pay my rent. I was paying my rent until they moved the number. I teach my daughter that honesty matters. I do everything right. And this man I've never even met, is taking my home because my 9-year-old returned a watch. I know. How is that possible? How is any of this happening? Because men like Mercer count on people like you being too tired to fight back. That's his whole system. Exhaustion, isolation, the belief that nobody's coming. Nobody is coming? Somebody already came. There are 27 people in this garage right now, Rachel, fixing the roof, rewiring the electrical panels, driving to Frankfurt with paperwork. They're here because your daughter walked through a storm and did the right thing, and that act, that one small act of honesty, woke up a whole town. Rachel was crying. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that leaks out of you at midnight when your daughter is asleep, and the rent just went up and you've been standing for 11 hours and your shoes have holes and there's nothing left between you and the dark except the sound of your own breathing. What does she need me to do? Rachel asked. Say yes, that's all. Say yes, and let someone fight for you. The silence lasted 8 seconds. 8 seconds of a woman standing at the edge of her own endurance, looking down at the fall and deciding whether to jump or turn around. Yes, Rachel said. Donna exhaled. Her hand was shaking. She held the phone against her ear and said, I'll have someone call you in the morning. Donna. Yeah. Tell Mr. Harlan. Rachel's voice caught. Tell him Maddie drew a picture of the garage at school. She put motorcycles in the parking lot and a sign that says honesty. She spelled it wrong. She put 2 N's. Donna pressed her hand against her mouth. She didn't make a sound, but the tears ran down her face and hit the desk beside the ticking watch. And somewhere in that small breaking moment, the war that Dwayne Mercer had started became something he couldn't win. Because you can't defeat a movement that runs on the misspelled drawings of a 9-year-old girl and the quiet, exhausted courage of her mother. Sunday passed in a blur of wrenches and phone calls and cold coffee and colder air. Monday morning arrived at 7 a.m. with a knock on the bay door. Dale Overton stood in the parking lot with his clipboard and his badge and his pressed shirt and 3 people behind him. Two county inspectors in hard hats and a woman from the fire marshal's office with a tablet and a measuring tape. Behind them, parked at the curb, a dark sedan. Lowell Pratt sat inside it, watching. Caleb opened the bay doors. The garage was spotless. The electrical panels had been rewired and labeled. The roof was patched. The fire extinguishers were current. The ventilation met code. The plumbing was tight. The exits were clear. Even the leak in Bay 3 was gone, replaced by a sealed patch that Holt had installed with marine-grade caulk and the stubborn precision of a man who believed that if you're going to fix something, you fix it once and forever. Overton walked through the garage. He checked everything he'd checked before and more. He opened panels. He measured clearances. He tested outlets. He photographed every corner. The two inspectors followed with their own checklists. The fire marshal's representative measured distances between equipment and walls and wrote numbers on her tablet with the expressionless efficiency of someone who didn't care about the politics and only cared about the numbers. It took 90 minutes. When they finished, Overton stood by the front counter with his clipboard. He didn't look at Caleb. He looked at the clipboard. He clicked his pen 3 times. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "the property is in compliance." "I know," Caleb said. "There are no violations at this time." "I know." Overton turned and walked out. The inspectors followed. The fire marshal followed. They got in their vehicles and drove away, and Lowell Pratt's sedan sat at the curb for 30 more seconds, long enough for Caleb to walk to the bay door and stand there, watching, with his arms at his sides and the watch in his pocket and the entire weight of the last 2 weeks in his eyes. The sedan pulled away. Caleb watched it go. And then his phone rang. Colleen Marsh. Frankfurt. "The injunction is filed," she said. "Emergency hearing is set for Wednesday at 9 a.m. Judge Patricia Kessler, Ash Creek County Courthouse. Kessler is independent, no connections to Mercer, Pratt, or the assessor's office. She's reviewing Jean's records now. What are the odds? If the pattern holds up under scrutiny, and I believe it will, she'll issue a temporary restraining order halting the eviction, and she'll open a formal inquiry into Mercer's property practices. And if it doesn't hold up, then Rachel Whitaker has 12 days left, and Mercer wins." Caleb hung up. He stood in his garage, his father's garage, the garage with his family name on the sign, the garage where a 9-year-old girl had walked through a storm and handed him back the watch that carried the only words that mattered. He looked at the room, at the repaired ceiling, at the rewired panels, at the cleared exits and the current extinguishers and the sealed roof and the concrete floor that still had oil stains shaped like countries on a map nobody would ever want to visit, but that 27 people had just decided to defend. Wednesday, 9 a.m., Judge Kessler. Everything, every handshake, every phone call, every midnight confession, every mile ridden and every mile walked, every quarter in a mason jar and every misspelled drawing of a garage with motorcycles in the lot, came down to a courtroom, a judge, and a manila folder full of the truth. Caleb picked up the watch. He turned it over. The engraving caught the light. "Do right when no one is watching." He put it in his pocket. He felt it tick against his ribs. And he realized, standing there in the cold morning light, with the taste of bad coffee and the smell of motor oil and the sound of Harleys idling somewhere in the distance like wolves waiting to run, that for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing right when no one was watching. He was doing right when everyone was. And that was harder. And it mattered more. And in 2 days, he'd find out whether it was enough, or whether Dwayne Mercer's empire of silence would swallow one more family and one more garage and one more man who'd finally stopped running from the truth. The watch ticked. The Harleys rumbled. And Caleb Harlan stood in his father's garage and waited for Wednesday the way soldiers wait for dawn, knowing it's coming, not knowing what it brings, holding the line because the line is all there is. Wednesday morning broke clean and cold over Ash Creek, Kentucky. The kind of morning where the frost on the windshields looks like shattered glass, and the sky is so blue it hurts to stare at it, like the world decided overnight to stop hiding behind clouds and show you exactly what it looks like when there's nowhere left to run. Caleb was dressed by 5, not in leather, not in grease. He wore a clean flannel shirt that he'd ironed himself on the workbench using a shop towel and a clothes iron he'd borrowed from Donna. Dark jeans without oil stains. Boots he'd polished with a rag and saddle soap until the leather looked almost respectable. He'd trimmed his beard with scissors over the bathroom sink at 4:30 a.m., watching gray hairs fall into the basin like ash from a fire that had been burning too long. The watch was in his vest pocket, the only piece of the old uniform he kept. He needed it against his ribs. He needed to feel it ticking. Boyd picked him up at 7 in the F-250. They didn't talk for the first 10 minutes. The truck smelled like coffee and canvas and the particular silence of men who've said everything important and are now waiting for the world to answer. "You eat?" Boyd asked. "No." "You should eat." "I'll eat after." "After what?" "After I find out whether any of this mattered." Boyd drove. The heater rattled. The cracked windshield caught the early sun and split it into fractured light that danced across the dashboard. They passed the Ridgeline Apartments on Sycamore, 3 stories of stained siding and crumbling concrete, laundry hanging from a second-floor balcony. Despite the cold, a child's bicycle chained to the railing with a lock that was bigger than the bike. Rachel's window was on the 3rd floor. The curtain was closed. They passed Cedar Street Pawn and Loan. The storefront window was dark. Mercer's sedan was not in the lot. Caleb looked at the window full of other people's losses. The guitars, the tools, the jewelry, the dented saxophone, and thought about 5 families who'd been erased from their homes by a man who measured everything in leverage and nothing in cost. The Ash Creek County Courthouse sat on a hill at the east end of Main Street, a 2-story brick building with white columns and a flagpole, and the kind of institutional architecture that's supposed to make you feel like justice lives there, even when it doesn't. The parking lot was half full when they arrived. Colleen Marsh was waiting on the steps, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a briefcase that she carried like a weapon. She wore a charcoal suit and no jewelry and the expression of a lawyer who's done this enough times to know that preparation beats prayer every single time. "Harlan," she said. "Maddox. Ms. Marsh. I filed the emergency motion at 7:30. Judge Kessler has reviewed the preliminary documents. Pratt filed a counter-motion at 8:05 opposing the injunction on procedural grounds." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. "He's arguing that the eviction is a private landlord-tenant matter and that our filing constitutes improper third-party interference." "Will that work?" Caleb asked. "Not if the pattern holds. Kessler isn't stupid. She'll see 5 prior evictions through the same shell companies with the same lawyer and the same assessor involvement, and she'll understand that this isn't a landlord-tenant dispute. It's a system." "And Rachel?" "She's inside. Donna brought her. Maddie is at school." Caleb nodded. He looked at the courthouse doors. Heavy, wooden. The kind of doors that take effort to push open. The kind that make you earn your entry. He thought about every door he'd walked through in his life. The garage door his father opened every morning at 7. The door of the scorched iron clubhouse in Louisville. The door of the house he should have stopped at 14 months sooner than he did. The door Maddie walked through on a rainy Tuesday night carrying a dead man's watch in a cardboard box. He pushed the courthouse doors open and went inside. The hearing room was small, not the grand courtroom you see in movies, but a functional room with wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, and rows of chairs that smelled like furniture polish and anxiety. Judge Patricia Kessler sat behind a raised desk at the front. She was 62, silver-haired, and had the particular stillness of a woman who's spent 3 decades listening to people lie and has developed an allergy to it. Rachel sat in the front row with Donna beside her. She was wearing the nicest clothes she owned, a dark blouse, pressed slacks, shoes that didn't have holes. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked like a woman who'd been preparing for this moment the way soldiers prepare for deployment, by accepting that the outcome is not in her control but showing up anyway because showing up is the only thing that is. Caleb sat behind her. Boyd sat beside him. Wade, Tommy, Jean, Holt, Clara, Faye. They filed in one by one, filling the rows like witnesses at a trial that wasn't a trial but felt like one. 22 people in a room built for 30, breathing the same recycled air, carrying the same quiet determination. Lowell Pratt sat at the opposite table. He wore a suit that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. His briefcase was leather. His pen was silver. His face held the composed confidence of a man who'd done this before and won and expected to win again because the system was designed for men like him to win. Dwayne Mercer sat behind Pratt. He wore a polo shirt and khakis and the expression of a man who couldn't understand why he was here, because in his world, problems like Rachel Whitaker were supposed to disappear quietly, and the fact that this one hadn't was an affront to the natural order of things. Judge Kessler called the hearing to order. Marsh presented the motion. She laid out the case the way Boyd would lay out a battle plan, systematically, precisely, without emotion, letting the facts carry the weight. 5 evictions, 3 shell companies, 1 lawyer, 1 assessor, 1 pawnshop owner at the center of a web that used property law and political connections to remove anyone who challenged him. She presented Gene's research, the property records, the corporate filings, the timeline of evictions, the pattern of code complaints followed by assessor involvement followed by Pratt's legal action. She presented Tommy's sister's confirmation that Pratt had pulled Caleb's records 3 times in 1 week. She presented the midnight phone call, documented by Caleb, corroborated by the phone records Marsh had subpoenaed. And then she presented Rachel. Rachel stood. She didn't look at Mercer. She didn't look at Pratt. She looked at Judge Kessler with the steady, exhausted, unbreakable gaze of a woman who'd been standing on her feet for 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for years. A woman who'd taught her daughter that honesty matters more than survival, and was now watching the world test that belief. "Ms. Whitaker," Marsh said, "can you describe the events of the past 2 weeks?" Rachel described them: the eviction notice, the rent increase, the phone call from her landlord, the letter from Pratt's office. She described them without self-pity, without drama, without the strategic emotional performance that lawyers sometimes coach their clients to deliver. She described them the way she would describe a shift at the diner, factually, chronologically, with the bone-deep weariness of someone who's been keeping records in her head because she can't afford a lawyer to keep them on paper. "And the initial event," Marsh said, "your daughter found a watch." "My daughter found a watch in a parking lot. She could have sold it. She chose to return it. That's all she did. She did the right thing." "And what happened after that?" "A man I've never met decided to punish me for it." The room was silent. Rachel sat down. Donna put a hand on her shoulder. Rachel didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into it either. The gesture of a woman who'd been holding herself upright for so long that she'd forgotten how to accept support without calculating the cost. Pratt stood. He was smooth, professional. He argued that the eviction was a routine landlord-tenant matter based on legitimate lease violations. He argued that the shell companies were standard business structures used by property owners throughout the state. He argued that the pattern Marsh described was coincidental, not conspiratorial, and that the court had no basis for inferring retaliatory intent from public records. He was good. Caleb watched him work and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who's spent his life around dangerous people, that Pratt wasn't evil. He was competent. He was a precision instrument in the hands of a man who used money and law and political connections the way other men use fists. Not because he hated anyone, but because the system paid him to and he'd never seen a reason to question it. Judge Kessler listened. She listened to Marsh. She listened to Pratt. She reviewed the documents. She asked 4 questions, 2 to Marsh, 2 to Pratt. And each question was surgical, precise, aimed at the exact junction where the facts met the law and the law met the lives of real people. Then she looked at Mercer. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you're not a party to this motion, but you're present in the courtroom. I note that your name appears as the beneficial owner of 3 property-holding entities involved in 5 prior eviction actions over a 4-year period. I also note that in each case, the eviction was preceded by a complaint or dispute between the tenant and your pawn business. Do you wish to make a statement?" Mercer looked at Pratt. Pratt gave a barely perceptible nod. Mercer stood. "Your Honor, I'm a businessman. I own property. I run a licensed pawn business. Everything I do is legal. I don't understand why I'm being treated like a defendant when I haven't been charged with anything." "You're not being treated like a defendant, Mr. Mercer. You're being asked to account for a pattern. Patterns are how courts distinguish between coincidence and conduct." Mercer's jaw tightened. The composure cracked. Just for a moment. Just enough for the room to see the man behind the polo shirt and the pressed khakis. The man who'd offered a 9-year-old girl $40 for a silver watch. and called it fair market value. "I have nothing else to say," Mercer said. "Then sit down." He sat. The room breathed. Judge Kessler took 17 minutes to review the final documents. 17 minutes of silence so thick you could feel it on your skin. Rachel stared at her hands. Caleb stared at the judge. Boyd stared at the ceiling. Wade's prosthetic clicked against the floor. Once, twice, the nervous tick of a soldier waiting for the outcome of something he can't control. Kessler looked up. "The court finds sufficient evidence of a retaliatory pattern in the eviction actions originating from properties owned by entities connected to Mr. Dwayne Mercer. The emergency injunction is granted. The eviction of Rachel Whitaker from 312 Sycamore Street, Unit 3B, is hereby stayed pending a full investigation into the property practices of Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, Cedar Capital Partners, and Bluegrass Property Trust. Additionally, the court is referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential violations of tenant protection statutes." The gavel came down. The sound was small, wood on wood, but it went through the room like a thunderclap. Rachel didn't move. She sat perfectly still with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed, and the tears that ran down her face were silent, the kind that come when the body finally believes what the mind has been afraid to hope for. Donna put her arm around Rachel's shoulders. This time, Rachel leaned in. Caleb exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. His hands were shaking, not with fear, not with rage, but with the particular tremor that comes when you've been bracing for impact and the impact doesn't come. Mercer stood up from his chair. He didn't look at anyone. He walked out of the hearing room with Pratt behind him, and the door closed behind them with a sound that was neither dramatic nor quiet, just the sound of a door closing on a man who'd built his life on silence and had just discovered that silence has an expiration date. Outside the courthouse, the November sun was still sharp and cold and clean. The group stood on the steps: Boyd, Wade, Tommy, Jean, Holt, Clara, Donna, Faye, and the others. And they looked at each other the way people look at each other after surviving something together. Not with celebration, not with triumph, with the quiet, bone-deep recognition that what they'd done had cost them time and sleep and comfort, and that it had been worth every hour. Rachel stood apart from the group, leaning against the stone railing, looking at the parking lot. Caleb walked over and stood beside her. They didn't look at each other. They looked at the town below. The rooftops, the bare trees, the streets where people were going about their Wednesday mornings without knowing what had just happened in a small hearing room on a hill. "Thank you," Rachel said. Her voice was raw. "Don't thank me. I'm the reason Mercer came after you. You're also the reason he stopped. Other people stopped him. You just stood in a room full of strangers and told them every bad thing you've ever done so they'd trust you enough to help a woman you barely know." Rachel turned and looked at him. Her eyes were red. Her face was tired. But something in her posture had shifted. The weight she'd been carrying alone for years had redistributed, shared, held by hands she hadn't known were there. "My daughter returned a watch. You returned something bigger." "What's that?" "The idea that people show up." Caleb didn't have words for what that sentence did to him. He stood in the cold sun and felt it settle into him like heat into frozen metal. Slow, deep, permanent. "Maddie gets out of school at 3, Rachel said. "She's going to want to see the garage." "The garage will be there." "So will we." Rachel paused. "If that's okay." "It's okay?" She nodded. Donna took her arm and walked her to the car. Caleb watched them go. 2 women walking across a parking lot in the cold sun. One leaning on the other, both of them stronger than any man he'd ever ridden with. Boyd appeared beside him. "Marsh says the state AG investigation could take months. Mercer isn't finished." "I know. But the injunction holds. Rachel's safe. For now." "For now is enough." "Is it?" Caleb looked at the courthouse, at the flag on the pole, at the blue sky. "It's more than she had 2 weeks ago. It's more than those 5 families had. It's a start. And starts are what you build on." "Then we build." They drove back to the garage. The neon sign buzzed in the daylight. The Harleys sat in the lot. The bay doors were open, and the inside smelled like coffee and motor oil and the faint ghost of last night's effort. Metal filings, caulk, electrical tape, the particular scent of a space that's been worked on by people who cared. Caleb walked to the workbench. The watch sat where he'd left it that morning, in the cardboard box, on the folded paper towel, the second hand ticking. He picked it up, held it, turned it over. Do right when no one is watching. He'd been carrying those words for 23 years. He'd carried them through a failed marriage, an abandoned daughter, a DUI, 14 months with the scorched iron, a midnight ride out of Louisville, and 3 years of silence in a garage that was slowly becoming a tomb. He'd carried them the way some men carry scars, as evidence of survival, not as instructions for living. But Maddie had read those words on the back of a watch she found in a parking lot, and she'd understood them instantly at 9 years old, in a way that Caleb hadn't understood them in 6 decades. Do right when no one is watching, not because someone is keeping score, not because there's a reward, because the act itself is the point, because honesty isn't a transaction, because a $5 cardboard box carried through a thunderstorm is worth more than every item in Dwayne Mercer's glass cases combined. He set the watch on the workbench and went to the back office. The letter to Caroline, the one he'd mailed, the one traveling through the postal system toward Virginia, the one carrying his inadequate words toward a daughter who might throw it away, was gone. Sent. Irretrievable. But the legal pad was still there, and on it was the line he'd written at midnight. For Maddie. For Caroline, for the ones I rode past. He tore the page from the pad and folded it and put it in his wallet beside the $300 Rachel had refused. Then he started making calls. The next 3 weeks changed the texture of Ash Creek the way a hard winter changes the texture of a road. Slowly, invisibly, and in ways you don't notice until you look back and realize the surface is completely different. The Ash Creek Honesty Fund became real. Not a concept, not a plan on a legal pad, a thing with structure and purpose, and Boyd's clipboard behind it like a spine. They set it up simply. Donations went into an account that Boyd and Donna co-managed, and the money went out to families identified through a quiet network of people who saw need before it became crisis. Clara, the nurse, flagged patients who paid medical co-pays in change. Jean monitored utility shutoff notices through public records. The servers at the Bluegrass Diner kept a running list of regulars who'd stopped ordering food and started ordering only coffee. Nobody was asked to beg. Nobody was asked to qualify. Nobody was asked to prove they deserved help. The help just appeared. An envelope in a mailbox. A grocery delivery on a doorstep. A utility bill paid by an anonymous account. Caleb put his father's watch in a glass display case on the front counter of the garage, where anyone who walked in could see it. Beside it, a small brass plate that Wade had machined in the shop. Do right when no one is watching. Davis Harlan, 1941 to 2001. People came in to look at it. Some of them stayed to talk. Some of them stayed to donate. Some of them stayed to ask for help and found it waiting before they finished the sentence. Holt fixed the Ridgeline's fire suppression system on a Saturday, working with Judd and 2 volunteers from the county fire department who'd heard about the fund and showed up with equipment and the quiet fury of public servants who'd been watching Mercer's building slide past inspection for years. The landlord, stripped of Mercer's backing and facing a state investigation, dropped the eviction and rolled the rent back to its original amount. Rachel got a letter confirming it on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it in the diner break room, standing between the mop bucket and the time clock. And she didn't cry because she'd used up all her tears on the courthouse steps and hadn't made any new ones yet. Mercer's pawn shop stayed open. The investigation was slow. The machinery of state oversight grinds at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency of the people caught in its gears. But something had changed in Ash Creek. People stopped going to Cedar Street Pawn and Loan, not because anyone organized a boycott, not because anyone told them to. They just stopped, one by one, family by family. The woman who would have sold her ring went to a jeweler in Lexington instead. The man who would have pawned his tools called Harland Motor Works and asked if he could trade labor for a small loan. The teenager who would have sold her guitar kept it and started playing at the coffee shop on weekends. Mercer noticed. He stood behind his glass counter and watched the foot traffic dwindle and didn't understand that what he was watching wasn't a boycott, but something quieter and more permanent. A town that had been shown who he was and had decided, without discussion, without organization, without a single meeting or petition, that they didn't need him anymore. On a Thursday evening in early December, 3 weeks after the hearing, Caleb was closing the garage. The neon sign buzzed. The Harleys sat under the overhang. The bay doors were down. The space heater rattled in the back office. He was wiping down the workbench when he heard a car pull into the lot. Not a Harley, not a truck, but a small sedan with out-of-state plates. He went to the window. A woman was getting out of the car. Mid-20s, brown hair, a coat that was too thin for Kentucky winter. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the sign. Harland Motor Works, assessed 1979. And didn't move for a long time. Caleb's heart stopped. Not literally, but something inside his chest seized the way an engine seizes when the oil runs dry. A sudden, total, catastrophic stillness that left him unable to breathe or think or do anything except stare through the window at the woman standing in his parking lot. Caroline. He went to the side door, opened it, stood in the doorway. The cold air hit his face. She turned and looked at him across 20 feet of cracked asphalt and 6 years of silence and the entire accumulated wreckage of a father who'd chosen road miles over bedtime stories and engine noise over conversation and the myth of toughness over the reality of love. She looked like her mother. She looked like the photograph by the register, the gap-toothed girl squinting into the sun, except the gaps were filled and the squint was gone, and what replaced it was the guarded, assessing expression of a young woman who'd learned to protect herself from disappointment by expecting it. "Caroline," he said, "I got your letter." "I know. I almost didn't come." "I know that too." She stood in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath visible in the December air. "You told me about a girl, a 9-year-old, Maddie. You told me she reminded you of me." "She does." "I'm not 9 anymore, Dad." "No, you're not." She looked at the garage, at the neon sign, at the Harleys, at the man standing in the doorway who was her father, and a stranger, and both things at once in the way that only absence can create. "The fund," she said. "I looked it up. Somebody wrote about it in a Lexington newspaper. They mentioned you." "Yeah." "They mentioned the scorched iron." "Yeah." "They mentioned a house in Louisville, children." "Yeah." Caroline's jaw worked. Something moved behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not anger, but the complicated, shifting, unresolvable weight of a daughter trying to reconcile the man who left with the man who stayed. The man who rode past with the man who stopped. The father she'd lost with the father standing in a doorway 12 feet away, looking at her like she was the only exit in a burning building. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said. "I'm not ready for that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. Okay? But I'm here, and that's something. That's everything." She didn't come inside, not yet. She stood in the parking lot and he stood in the doorway, and the distance between them was 12 feet and 6 years and a lifetime of things that couldn't be unsaid or undone, and neither of them tried to close it because some distances need to be crossed slowly, one step at a time, with the full knowledge that the crossing might take years and might never be complete. "Can I see the watch?" she asked. Caleb went inside. He took the watch from the glass case on the counter. He brought it back to the doorway and held it out. Caroline crossed the parking lot, 12 feet, 6 years, a lifetime, and took it from his hand. Their fingers touched. The contact lasted half a second. It was enough. She turned the watch over and read the engraving. Her lips moved. "Do right when no one is watching." She looked up at her father with eyes that were wet and hard and searching. "Grandpa really lived by this," she said. "Every day." "Did you?" "No, not for a long time. Not until a kid walked through a storm and showed me what it looked like." Caroline held the watch for another moment. Then she handed it back. "I'm staying at a motel on Route 12. I'll be here until Friday. Can I buy you dinner?" "Not tonight, maybe tomorrow." "Tomorrow is good." "Maybe." She walked back to the car. She opened the door. She looked at him one more time across the parking lot, across the cracked asphalt and the neon light and the cold December air and all the years that sat between them like a country neither of them had a map for. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." The letter. The part where you said you wrote 5 drafts and couldn't finish any of them. Yeah. That was the part that made me come. She got in the car, the engine started, the headlights swept the lot, and then she was gone, driving down Pershing Street toward Route 12, taillights glowing red in the dark like the last embers of something that wasn't dead after all. Caleb stood in the parking lot. The cold bit his face. The neon sign hummed. The watch ticked in his hand, steady, patient, relentless, the way it had ticked through 2 wars and a dead father's pocket and a broken son's vest and a 9-year-old girl's cardboard box and all the silence and noise and distance and stillness that filled the space between what a man is and what he could be. He went back inside. He put the watch in the glass case. He turned off the lights. He locked the doors. He sat on his bike in the dark parking lot and didn't start it. He just sat there, feeling the cold settle into his bones, listening to the town grow quiet around him. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a text to Rachel's number. Tell Maddie I'm okay. Tell her the watch is still ticking. The reply came 30 seconds later. Not from Rachel. The message was typed in the careful, slightly misspelled way that 9-year-old fingers type on a screen too big for their hands. That's good, Mr. Harlan. Hanesi matters. Caleb looked at the screen. 2 N's. She'd spelled it with 2 N's, just like the drawing. He put the phone in his pocket. He started the engine. The Harley shook beneath him. Alive, loud, real. He pulled out of the lot and turned west on Pershing, riding slow, riding easy, not running from anything and not running toward anything, just riding through a cold Kentucky night in a small town that had finally remembered what it was supposed to be. Behind him, the neon sign buzzed red into the dark. The watch ticked behind glass. And inside the quiet, ticking heart of Harlan Motor Works, the Ash Creek Honesty Fund, born from a storm, a child, a cardboard box, and 6 words engraved on the back of a dead soldier's watch, kept running. Not loudly, not grandly, just steadily, the way honest things do, the way they always have.